The derringer pressed cold against her ribs. Thomas's voice hissed in her ear. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize you? Grace's heart hammered as he dragged her backward toward the dark waters of San Francisco Bay. Behind them, Wyatt's desperate shout cut through the chaos, but the gun was already digging deeper. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. But to understand how a mail-order bride ended up in a deadly standoff with the con man who destroyed her life, we need to go back to where it all began. Before we dive into Grace's incredible journey, do me a favor, hit that like button if you love stories of survival and second chances. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next tale of courage and redemption. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers around the world. Now let's begin. Montana Territory, October 1887. They said she brought death wherever she walked. They said the debts of the man she came to marry would swallow anyone who showed her mercy. So when Grace Winters arrived in Copper Ridge on a cold October afternoon in 1887, clutching a 6-year-old child's hand and carrying nothing but a worn leather suitcase, the town locked its doors like she carried plague. The stagecoach driver wouldn't meet her eyes when he said it. Ma'am, I'm real sorry, but Thomas Ashford's been dead 3 weeks now. You came all this way for nothing. Grace stood on the wooden boardwalk, the Montana wind cutting through her thin traveling dress, and felt the last of her hope crumble to dust. 3 weeks. She'd spent 6 days rattling across territories on trains and coaches, spent the last of her money on passage, dragged Emma through strange towns and hostile glances, all to marry a man who was already in the ground. The driver tossed her suitcase down. It landed with a pathetic thump, light enough that anyone watching would know she owned nothing of value. He climbed back onto his seat without another word, snapped the reins, and the coach rolled away down the rutted main street, disappearing into a cloud of dust that hung in the still air like a curtain closing on her last chance. Emma's small hand tightened in hers. Mama Grace, I'm thirsty. Grace looked down at the child, 6 years old with blonde curls escaping from beneath her bonnet and eyes too old for her face. Emma wasn't her daughter by blood. She was the child of Sarah Mitchell, Grace's only friend in New York, the woman who died of consumption in Grace's arms 18 months ago, with one final whispered plea. Promise me you'll give her a life I couldn't. Grace had promised, and she'd kept that promise through everything that came after. Through the scandal when her own husband, John Winters, died under suspicious circumstances, and the police questioned her for weeks. Through the creditors who seized everything she owned. Through the whispers that followed her through every street in Manhattan, until she couldn't find work, couldn't rent a room, couldn't even buy bread without seeing suspicion in the shopkeeper's eyes. The advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper had seemed like salvation. Rancher in Montana Territory seeks respectable woman for marriage. Widow with child welcome. Home security and fresh start guaranteed. The letters that followed had been carefully written, thoughtful, promising. Thomas Ashford had seemed like an answer to prayer. Now he was dead, and Grace was standing in a strange town with 50 cents in her pocket and winter coming on fast. I know, sweetheart, Grace said, forcing her voice to stay calm. We'll find water. We'll find somewhere to rest. But even as she said it, she could feel the weight of eyes on her. Women peered from behind curtains. Men paused in doorways and then deliberately turned away. The whole town seemed to be watching her arrival with the cold assessment of people who'd already decided she wasn't welcome. Grace picked up her suitcase and started walking. The main street of Copper Ridge was a single rutted road lined with weathered buildings, a mercantile store with a painted sign, a saloon with bat-wing doors, a boarding house with a no vacancy sign already prominent in the window. Even though Grace could see empty rooms through the glass, a church at the far end, white painted and proper, its door firmly closed. She tried the mercantile first. A bell chimed when she pushed open the door, bright and hopeful in the dim interior. The store smelled of flour and coffee and leather. Shelves lined the walls packed with goods. Behind the counter stood a woman of about 45, well-dressed in dark calico, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her hands stilled on the ledger she'd been marking when she saw Grace. Her expression shifted from mild interest to something harder. Mrs. Whitaker, Grace said, reading the name on the account book. My name is Grace Winters. I've just arrived from New York. I was hoping you could direct me to the Ashford Ranch. I have business with Thomas Ashford. The woman's mouth pressed into a thin line. Thomas Ashford is dead, I know. The driver told me. But surely there's someone I can speak with. About his affairs. About arrangements he made. What kind of arrangements? Grace hesitated, then lifted her chin. I was contracted to marry him. I have his letters. He promised me passage here, a home, a future for my daughter. Helen Whitaker's eyes flickered to Emma, who stood close to Grace's skirts, trying to make herself small. The woman's expression didn't soften. Mail order bride. It wasn't a question. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. I prefer to think of it as a private arrangement between adults. I'm sure you do, Mrs. Whitaker closed her ledger with a snap. Well, Mrs. Winters, I'm afraid your arrangement died with Thomas Ashford. He owed money all over this territory. Half the ranchers in this county lost savings because of him. Some folks lost everything. I had nothing to do with his debts. Doesn't matter. You came here to marry him. That makes you part of it. That's not fair. I never even met the man. Fair. Mrs. Whitaker's laugh was bitter. Was it fair when Thomas Ashford borrowed $300 from my late husband, promising to pay it back with interest, and then spent it all on whiskey and card games? Was it fair when he left town owing money to the bank, to the feed store, to half the widows in this county who were fool enough to trust him? Grace's hands tightened on her suitcase handle. I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but I'm not responsible for what he did. You came here to profit from him, to share in whatever he'd built with stolen money. That makes you complicit. I came here because I have a child to feed and nowhere else to go. Grace's voice broke despite her best efforts. I'm asking for work, any work. I can clean, sew, cook, keep accounts. I'm a hard worker and I don't ask for charity. Just a chance. There's no work here for you. Mrs. Whitaker's voice was final. My advice is to get on the next coach heading anywhere else. There's nothing in Copper Ridge for Thomas Ashford's woman. But I have no money for passage. That's not my problem. The words hung in the air between them. Emma made a small sound, quickly stifled. Grace looked at the woman behind the counter, at the hardness in her eyes, and realized that arguing was pointless. This wasn't about logic or fairness. This was about pain that needed somewhere to land, and Grace was the nearest target. She turned and walked out, the cheerful bell mocking her departure. The boarding house was next. Mrs. Agnes Talbot answered. Grace's knock, took one look at her face and said, "No rooms available," before closing the door firmly. Through the window, Grace could see at least 3 rooms with unmade beds clearly empty. She tried the dress shop. The seamstress wouldn't even come to the door, just waved her away from behind the glass. The saloon, the owner, a thick-necked man named Briggs, opened the door a crack, looked her up and down and said, "I heard you were Thomas Ashford's mail-order bride." "That true, yes. But I never met him, and I'm not responsible for his debts. Don't care, don't need that kind of trouble." The door slammed. An hour passed, then 2. Grace walked from business to business, door to door, and found them all locked against her. Some people were coldly polite, others were openly hostile. One old rancher spat tobacco juice when he saw her coming and crossed the street to avoid her. Emma never complained, but Grace could feel her daughter's exhaustion in every dragging step, could see it in the way she kept rubbing her eyes. The child hadn't eaten since breakfast, and that had been stale bread and weak coffee at a way station 20 miles back. "Mama," Grace, Emma finally whispered. "I'm so thirsty." "I know, baby. I know." There was a water pump in the small square at the center of town beside a horse trough. Grace led Emma to it, set down her suitcase, and worked the handle. The pump groaned and resisted, but finally water gushed out clear and cold. She cupped her hands and let Emma drink first, watching the child's throat work as she swallowed desperately. Then Grace drank herself, the water so cold it hurt her teeth. It was the first good thing she'd felt all day, and it made her want to cry. The sun was sinking now, the sky turning deep purple at the edges. The businesses were closing windows, going dark one by one. Grace looked around the empty square and realized with growing horror that she had nowhere to go. No money for passage out, no friends, no shelter. Winter was coming and she and Emma would be sleeping in the open. She sank down onto the edge of the water trough, pulled Emma close and tried to think. But there was nothing to think about. She'd gambled everything on Thomas Ashford's promises, and she'd lost. "Mama," Emma said softly, looking up at her with those 2 wise eyes. Are we going to sleep here just for a little while? Grace lied, smoothing her daughter's hair. Just until I figure things out. But there was nothing to figure out. They were stranded. They were alone. And the night was coming. Grace wrapped her shawl around Emma's shoulders and held her close, watching the last light drain from the sky. The air grew cold. The stars began to appear hard and bright and indifferent. In the distance, she could hear voices from the saloon laughter that sounded cruel even from this far away. She thought about Sarah's last words. Promise me you will give her a life I couldn't. She thought about John Winters and the poison someone had slipped into his evening whiskey, the suspicion that had followed her ever since. She thought about Thomas Ashford and his careful letters, his promises, his lies. She thought about how very tired she was of being punished for other people's sins. No woman and child belong out here alone. The voice came from the shadows at the edge of the square, low and rough and certain. Grace's head snapped up. She couldn't see him clearly at first, just a tall silhouette against the darkening sky, broad-shouldered and still as stone. Then he stepped forward into the last of the fading light, and she could make out his features. A man in his mid-30s maybe. Weathered face, strong jaw, shadowed with stubble, dark hair under a worn Stetson. A long coat that had seen better days. Eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and felt even more. He moved with a slight limp she noticed favoring his left leg. I'm sorry, Grace said quickly, standing and pulling Emma behind her. We're not causing any trouble. We'll move on. Move on where the man's voice wasn't unkind, just matter of fact. Town's closed up for the night, and from what I saw, it was closed to you long before sunset. Heat flooded Grace's face. You were watching. Didn't need to watch. I know this town. I know how they treat people they've decided aren't worth their time. He came closer, and Grace could see his face more clearly now. Hard lines carved deep around his mouth and eyes. A scar cutting through his left eyebrow. But something in his expression that wasn't cruel. Something that might have been understanding or pity or just simple recognition of suffering. You're Thomas Ashford's mail-order bride, he said. It wasn't a question. Grace lifted her chin. I am. Does that mean you're going to turn away too? No. The single word spoken with such quiet certainty nearly undid her. She'd been braced for more rejection, more anger. This unexpected kindness caught her completely off guard. Why not everyone else has? The man was quiet for a long moment, studying her. Then he said, because I know what it's like to be alone, and because leaving a woman and child to freeze isn't something I can walk away from no matter what her last name is. I don't have money to pay you. Didn't ask for money. Then what do you want? His jaw tightened. Nothing you're thinking. I'm offering shelter for a night. Maybe two. That's all. You can accept it, or you can sit here and wait for the cold to make the decision for you. Emma tugged on Grace's sleeve. Mama Grace, I'm hungry. The man's expression softened slightly when he looked at Emma. Got stew on the stove. Beef and potatoes. Made too much like always. Grace felt tears prick her eyes and forced them back. She'd cried enough today. But God, she was so tired, so scared, and Emma needed food, needed warmth, needed more than Grace could give her, sitting beside a water pump in an empty town square. What's your name? Grace asked. Wyatt Brennan. The name stirred something in her memory. Something Thomas had mentioned once in one of his letters maybe, or something she'd overheard, but she was too exhausted to place it. I'm Grace. This is Emma, I know. Wyatt gestured toward the edge of the square where a horse stood waiting patient and still. Come on, night's getting colder. Grace hesitated one last moment, weighing the risk. Stay here and hope for a miracle, or trust a stranger who'd offered the first kindness she'd seen in months. What choice did she really have? She picked up her suitcase. All right, thank you. Wyatt nodded and walked toward his horse. Grace followed, Emma's hand clutched tight in hers, trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. The horse was a big roan mare with gentle eyes. Wyatt patted her neck, then turned to Grace. She'll carry all three of us. I'll ride. You and the girl can sit in front. He mounted first with practiced ease, then reached down. Grace handed him the suitcase, which he secured behind the saddle with quick efficiency. Then she lifted Emma up. Wyatt took the child easily, settling her in front of him with surprising gentleness. Then he extended his hand to Grace. She took it. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip strong, and he pulled her up behind Emma without apparent effort. It was crowded, all three of them on one horse, but the mare didn't seem to mind. "Hold on," Wyatt said. Grace wrapped her arms around Emma, anchoring them both. The mare started forward at an easy walk, leaving Copper Ridge behind. Grace looked back once at the town that had rejected her, at the dark windows and locked doors, and felt a strange mix of relief and despair. They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through the prairie grass. The moon rose full and bright, turning the landscape silver. The air smelled of sage and cold earth and coming winter. "How far?" Grace finally asked. "Another mile or so." Emma had gone quiet, her head resting against Wyatt's chest. Grace realized with a start that her daughter had fallen asleep. The child trusted this stranger more easily than Grace did. But then again, children had better instincts about these things. Or maybe Emma was just too exhausted to care. "You don't talk much, do you?" Grace said, more to fill the silence than anything. "Talking doesn't change much. I suppose not." Another stretch of quiet. Then Wyatt said, "Thomas Ashford. He wasn't a good man." It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway. "No, I imagine he wasn't. You knew that when you agreed to marry him, I never met him." Grace's voice went flat. "I only knew what he wrote in his letters. And those were full of lies, apparently. Why'd you agree to it? Coming all this way to marry a stranger because I had nowhere else to go." Grace stared out at the moonlit prairie. "My husband died 2 years ago under suspicious circumstances. I was questioned by the police. Never charged, but the damage was done. I lost everything. My home, my reputation, any chance at a normal life in New York. I couldn't find work. Couldn't even rent a room. People looked at me like I was poison." She paused, then added quietly, "Emma isn't my daughter by blood. She's the child of my best friend Sarah, who died of consumption. Before she passed, she made me promise to give Emma a better life, a fresh start. When I saw Thomas's advertisement, when I read his letters promising a home and no questions asked, I thought maybe this was our chance." Wyatt was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You came here on faith. I came here on desperation." Grace's voice was bitter. "There's a difference. Maybe, maybe not." They crested a low hill and Grace saw the ranch spread out below. A small cabin with smoke rising from the chimney. A barn, a corral with several horses. It wasn't much, but in the moonlight it looked like a kind of salvation. Wyatt guided the mare down the hill and into the yard. He dismounted first with that slight hitch in his movement, then helped Emma down. The child woke just enough to whimper, and Grace took her, holding her close. "Go on inside," Wyatt said, nodding toward the cabin. "Door's unlocked. I'll see to the mare." Grace hesitated. "Thank you. For this." Wyatt met her eyes and something unreadable passed across his face. "Don't thank me yet." Then he turned away, leading the mare toward the barn, and Grace carried Emma toward the cabin, toward warmth, toward the first shelter she'd had in what felt like a lifetime. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cabin was simple but clean. One main room with a stone fireplace where a fire burned low but steady. A wooden table with 2 chairs. A narrow bed into the corner. A small kitchen area with a cast iron stove. Everything spare and functional, the home of a man who lived alone and didn't need much. The smell of beef stew hung in the air, rich and savory. Grace's stomach clenched with hunger so fierce it was almost painful. She set Emma down on the bed and pulled off her daughter's shoes, then covered her with a quilt that had been folded at the foot of the mattress. Emma curled up, immediately asleep again, within seconds. Grace stood there looking around the cabin and felt a strange sense of dislocation. This morning she'd woken up on a stagecoach with no idea where she'd be sleeping tonight. And now she was here in the home of a stranger who'd offered help when no one else would. A stranger named Wyatt Brennan, who limped when he walked and had eyes full of old pain and seemed to understand exactly what it felt like to be alone. The door opened, and Wyatt stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He took off his hat and hung it on a peg by the door, then moved to the stove without looking at her. "Stew's still warm," he said, ladling 2 bowls full. He set them on the table, then gestured for Grace to sit. She did, even though part of her wanted to refuse, wanted to prove she didn't need his charity. But Emma needed her strong, and she couldn't be strong on an empty stomach. The first bite of stew was heaven. Hot, savory filling. Chunks of beef that fell apart on her tongue, potatoes, soft and perfectly seasoned carrots that still had some bite. Grace tried to eat slowly, tried to maintain some dignity, but within minutes she'd scraped the bowl clean. Wyatt pushed his own bowl towards her. Finish it. I can't. Yes, you can. I'll eat later. Grace wanted to argue, but she was still so hungry and the stew was so good. She ate the second bowl more slowly this time, and when she was done, she felt almost human again. Thank you, she said quietly. Wyatt nodded and began cleaning up, moving around the small kitchen with the ease of someone used to taking care of himself. Grace watched him, studying the way he moved. Careful, deliberate, favoring that left leg. There was a story there, she thought. A painful one. You can take the bed, Wyatt said, not looking at her. I'll sleep in the barn. No, Grace stood quickly. I can't take your bed. Emma and I can sleep in the barn. You're not sleeping in the barn. His voice was firm. It's cold out there and you've been through enough today. Take the bed. Where will you sleep? I've got a bedroll. I'll be fine by the fire. Grace wanted to protest, but she was too tired to fight. Just for tonight, she said. Tomorrow I'll figure something out. Wyatt didn't respond to that. He just finished cleaning up, then pulled a bedroll from a trunk in the corner and spread it out near the hearth. Grace moved toward the bed where Emma was curled up under the quilt. She carefully climbed in beside her daughter, trying not to wake her. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, and the quilt smelled like wood smoke and sage. Wyatt banked the fire, then settled onto his bedroll, his back to her. Mr. Brennan, Grace said into the darkness. Wyatt, Wyatt, why are you really doing this? The silence stretched so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then finally, quiet and rough, he said, because someone should have done it for her, her Grace asked. Who doesn't matter? Go to sleep, Mrs. Winters. Grace. Go to sleep, Grace. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the pain she heard buried in his voice. But exhaustion was pulling her down like a tide, and Emma was warm beside her, and for the first time in months she felt something that might almost be safety. So she closed her eyes and let sleep take her, unaware that in accepting this stranger's kindness, she just stepped into a story much larger than she knew. Unaware that Wyatt Brennan had secrets of his own, and that those secrets were tangled up with Thomas Ashford in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Unaware that this one night would become 2, then 3, then more. That in this small cabin on the edge of nowhere, something broken in both of them had just begun very slowly to heal. Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie, and the stars turned overhead, indifferent and eternal. And inside, 3 people who'd lost almost everything slept sheltered from the cold, held safe for now, by the fragile grace of a stranger's mercy. Grace woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood. Steady, rhythmic, relentless. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the events of yesterday came flooding back, and she opened her eyes to find herself in Wyatt Brennan's cabin, wrapped in a quilt that smelled like sage, with Emma still asleep beside her. Pale morning light filtered through the single window, turning everything soft and golden. The fire in the hearth had been rebuilt and was crackling cheerfully. On the table sat a plate covered with a cloth, steam still rising from beneath it. Grace sat up slowly, her body aching from days of travel and a night of actual rest. She hadn't slept that deeply in months, maybe years. The realization made her feel guilty and grateful in equal measure. She slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Emma, and moved to the table. Under the cloth, she found fresh biscuits, scrambled eggs, and strips of bacon. Her stomach growled loudly. The axe sound stopped. A moment later, the door opened, and Wyatt stepped inside carrying an armload of split wood. He glanced at her, nodded once, then moved to stack the wood beside the hearth. You didn't have to make breakfast, Grace said. Had to eat anyway. He straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. Figured you would too. I meant I could have. You were asleep. Eat while it's hot. There was no arguing with that tone. Grace sat down and began to eat, trying not to devour the food too quickly. Everything tasted better than it had any right to. The eggs perfectly seasoned, the biscuits light and buttery, the bacon crisp. After months of scraping by on stale bread and thin soup, it felt like luxury. Wyatt poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove and set one in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it, savoring the warmth. Thank you, she said, for all of this. He sat down across from her with his own coffee, but didn't eat. You planning to head back to town today, he asked. The question landed like a stone in her chest. I don't know. There's nothing for me there. There's nothing for you here either. The words were blunt, almost cruel, but his voice wasn't. It was just honest. Grace set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. I know that. I know you didn't sign up for taking care of a widow and her child. We'll leave after breakfast. I'll figure something out, figure what out. Wyatt's eyes were steady on her. You got no money, no prospects, in a town full of people who won't give you the time of day. Where exactly are you planning to go? I don't know. The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with frustration and fear. I don't know, all right, but I can't stay here. I won't be someone's burden. Didn't say you were a burden. You just said there's nothing for me here. That's not the same thing. He set down his cup. Look, I'm not good at this, at talking, at dealing with people. But what I'm trying to say is you can stay for a while, until you get your feet under you. Grace stared at him. Why would you do that? I already told you why. No, you gave me some cryptic answer about her and then told me to go to sleep. That's not an answer. Wyatt's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared into his coffee like it might give him the words he needed. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, each word pulled out with effort. I was engaged once, 5 years ago. Her name was Rachel. He paused and pain flickered across his face like lightning. She was everything good, kind, patient, always seeing the best in people. She saw the best in me anyway, which was a miracle in itself. Grace stayed quiet, sensing that if she spoke, he'd stop. We were supposed to get married in the spring. Had the date set, the preacher lined up everything. But that winter, something changed. She got quiet, stopped smiling as much. I asked what was wrong, and she'd say nothing, just tired. I believed her because I wanted to. His hands tightened around his cup. Then one morning I woke up and she was gone. Found her down by the creek. She'd walked into the water and never walked out. Oh God, Grace whispered. She left a note. Said she was tired of pretending everything was fine. Said she felt like a burden, like she was dragging me down. Said I deserved better than someone who couldn't even get out of bed most days. Wyatt's voice cracked. She thought she was doing me a favor. Thought she was setting me free. Tears blurred Grace's vision. I'm so sorry. I should have seen it. Should have pushed harder, asked better questions. But I was so focused on the ranch, on building something for our future, that I missed what was happening right in front of me. He finally looked up and his eyes were haunted. So when I see a woman sitting alone in a town square with no place to go, telling herself she doesn't deserve help, yeah, I remember Rachel. And I remember that sometimes people need help whether they think they deserve it or not. Grace couldn't speak. The weight of his grief, his guilt pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. I'm not asking you to stay forever, Wyatt continued. I'm not asking for anything. But winter's coming and you've got a child to think about. Stay until spring. Give yourself time to figure out what comes next, that's all. I can't just take your charity. It's not charity if you work for it. Wyatt's voice was matter-of-fact again. Ranch always needs extra hands. You can help with cooking, mending, whatever needs doing. Fair trade. Grace wanted to refuse. Wanted to prove she didn't need his help, didn't need anyone. But then she thought of Emma still sleeping in the bed, in the long cold winter ahead, and the locked doors of Copper Ridge. Until spring, she said finally, and I'll earn my keep, every bit of it. Wyatt nodded. Until spring. The door to the bedroom area creaked, and Emma appeared, rubbing her eyes. Mama Grace, I'm here, sweetheart. Grace held out her arms, and Emma ran to her, climbing into her lap. Did you sleep well? Uh-huh, Emma nodded shyly. I had dreams about horses. Wyatt's expression softened slightly. You like horses? Emma nodded, peeking at him from behind Grace's shoulder. Got a few in the barn. Maybe later you can come see them if your mama says it's all right. Emma's face lit up like sunrise. Can I, Mama Grace? Please, Grace looked at Wyatt, saw something gentle in his eyes that hadn't been there before, and felt her walls crack just a little. We'll see. But she already knew the answer would be yes. How could she deny Emma this small joy after everything the child had been through? The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Grace woke early, made breakfast, then set about whatever work needed doing. There was always something. Mending torn shirts, patching holes in socks, scrubbing pots, sweeping floors. She attacked each task with fierce determination, desperate to prove her worth. Wyatt worked from dawn until dusk, tending to the horses, fixing fences, chopping wood. He spoke little, but Grace began to notice things. The way he always left a plate of food warming on the stove for her. The way he'd repaired the loose leg on one of the chairs without saying a word. The way he'd carved a small wooden horse for Emma and left it on her pillow like it had appeared by magic. Emma thrived in ways that broke Grace's heart and healed it at the same time. Color returned to her cheeks. Her laughter came more easily. She spent hours in the barn with Wyatt learning to brush the horses, feed them, clean their hooves. Wyatt was patient with her in a way that surprised Grace. Gentle, teaching her how to move around the animals safely, answering her endless questions with quiet care. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The air grew colder, and the first snow began to fall, dusting the prairie in white. One afternoon, Grace was in the cabin mending one of Wyatt's shirts when she noticed something odd. The seam she was working on had already been stitched once badly with uneven loops and loose thread, and then torn open again deliberately. She frowned, examining it more closely. The tear looked fresh, intentional. She set the shirt aside and picked up another from the mending pile. Same thing, a repair that had been undone. Understanding hit her like a physical blow. He was making work for her, tearing his own clothes, breaking things that didn't need fixing, creating tasks so she'd feel useful, so she'd feel like she was earning her keep. Anger flared hot in her chest. She threw the shirt down and stormed outside. Wyatt was in the corral working with one of the younger horses. He looked up when he heard her coming, and something in her expression made him go still. "You've been sabotaging your own things," Grace said, her voice shaking. "Making extra work so I'd feel like I was contributing." Wyatt's face remained carefully neutral. "Don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, I'm not stupid. The shirt I was just mending had been deliberately torn, so had the one before it. How many others?" He looked away, jaw tight. "Why?" Grace demanded. "Why would you do that? Because you needed to believe you were earning your place here." Wyatt's voice was quiet but firm. "Because every time I tried to just give you something, food, shelter, whatever you looked at me like, I was offering you poison. So I made sure there was work. Made sure you could tell yourself you weren't taking charity. That's not your decision to make." "Maybe not, but I did it anyway." He turned back to her, and there was something fierce in his eyes. "You want to be angry, fine. Be angry, but don't pretend you would have stayed if you thought you were just taking from me. Don't pretend you wouldn't have walked out that door the first chance you got, dragging that little girl back to God knows where, just to prove you didn't need help." The truth of it stole her breath because he was right. She would have left. Would have taken Emma and walked straight back into danger just to prove she wasn't weak, wasn't a burden, wasn't someone who needed saving. "I hate that you're right," she whispered. "I know." They stood there in the cold snow falling around them, and something shifted between them. Some wall that had kept them at careful distance began to crack. "I don't know how to accept help," Grace said, her voice breaking. "Thomas taught me that needing anything made me weak. That asking for help was the same as admitting I'd failed. Thomas was wrong. Was he? Look at me. I'm a widow with nothing, living in a stranger's cabin, lying to myself about earning my keep." Wyatt crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and gripped her shoulders. His touch was firm, but not painful. "You're a woman who survived a bad marriage and came out the other side with your daughter is still safe. You're someone who kept going when most people would have quit. That's not weakness, Grace. That's strength. I don't feel strong. Strength isn't about feeling it. It's about doing what needs doing anyway." He took a step closer. "You want to earn your keep, Owen. Stop tearing yourself apart, trying to prove something that doesn't need proving. Stay, rest, let yourself heal. That's worth more than any mending." "I don't know if I can." "Then learn." The horse in the corral whinnied, breaking the tension. Wyatt released her shoulders and turned back to his work, and Grace stood there for another long moment before walking slowly back to the cabin. She picked up the shirt she'd thrown down, smoothed it out, and began to mend it properly. Not because she had to prove anything, but because it needed doing. Because Wyatt needed a shirt without holes, and she could give him that much. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Grace sat by the fire and watched Wyatt work on a piece of leather, crafting what looked like a new bridle. His hands moved with practiced skill, sure and steady. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. Wyatt didn't look up. "Sure, why do you live out here alone? You could have moved on after Rachel, started over somewhere else." Wyatt's hands stilled. "Thought about it, even packed up once, made it as far as Hadley Creek. But I couldn't do it, felt like leaving her behind. Like if I started over, I'd be saying she didn't matter. So you stay here and punish yourself instead. Maybe. He resumed his work. Or maybe I'm just not built for starting over. But you're helping me start over. That's different. How? Because you're alive. The words came out harsh, almost angry. You've got a chance. Rachel didn't get that. So yeah, maybe I stay here and punish myself. But at least I can make sure someone else gets the second chance she never had. Grace's chest ached. Wyatt, don't. He set down the leather. Don't say you're sorry again. Don't say any of it. I told you what happened so you'd understand why I'm helping, not so you'd feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for you. I just understand now why you look at me the way you do sometimes. What way? Like you're trying to save something you already lost. The silence that fell was heavy and hurting. Wyatt stood abruptly, grabbed his coat from the peg by the door. Going to check the barn, he muttered, and was gone before she could respond. Grace sat alone by the fire, listening to the wind howl outside, and wondered if two broken people could help each other heal, or if they'd just cut each other worse on their sharp edges. The answer came slowly in small moments over the following days. It came in the morning. She woke to find wildflowers in a jar on the table. Flowers he'd ridden miles to find, even though it was nearly winter. It came in the afternoon. She caught him teaching Emma to read using an old book of poems, his rough voice gentle as he sounded out the words. It came in the evening. She found him on the porch playing guitar, a sad, haunting melody that spoke of loss and longing, and he didn't stop when she sat down beside him to listen. And it came in the quiet moments when their hands would brush reaching for the same cup, or when their eyes would meet across the cabin and something unspoken would pass between them. Something that felt like recognition, like two people who'd been walking in darkness suddenly seeing each other in the light. 3 weeks turned to 4. The snow fell harder. The nights grew longer, and Grace began to believe just a little that maybe she could stay. That maybe this wasn't just survival. That maybe she deserved this small measure of peace. Then one morning she needed supplies. They were running low on flour, sugar, coffee. Wyatt offered to go, but Grace refused. I can't hide forever, she said. If I'm going to make a life here, even temporarily, I need to face that town. Wyatt's expression darkened. They won't be kind. I know. But I'm done running. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I'll come with you. You don't have to. I'm coming. There was no arguing with that tone. So they hitched up the wagon, bundled Emma in warm clothes, and made the 3-mile journey to Copper Ridge. The town looked different in winter. Harder, colder, less forgiving. They pulled up in front of the mercantile, and Grace felt every eye on the street turned toward them. Whispers started immediately. Wyatt helped her down from the wagon, his hand firm on her elbow. Stay close, he murmured. They walked into the store together, Emma between them. Helen Whitaker was behind the counter again, and her expression when she saw Grace was a complicated mix of surprise and disapproval. Mrs. Winters, Helen said, her voice cold. Mrs. Whitaker, I need supplies. Grace handed over a list she'd written. Helen's eyes flicked to Wyatt and something changed in her face. Calculation maybe, or concern. Mr. Brennan, didn't expect to see you in town. Needed supplies, Wyatt said flatly. I see. Helen took the list, scanned it. This will take a few minutes to put together. We'll wait. While Helen gathered the items, other customers began filtering into the store. Grace recognized some of them. Ranchers Thomas had borrowed from women who'd once been friendly. Now they whispered behind their hands, casting looks that ranged from pitying to disgusted. One man, thick-shouldered and mean-eyed, approached them directly. Grace recognized him from Thomas's letters. Vernon Holloway, a neighboring rancher who'd lost money in one of Thomas's schemes. But there was something else in his eyes. Something that looked almost like personal pain. Well, well, Vernon said, his voice loud enough to carry. If it isn't Thomas Ashford's mail-order whore, thought you'd have the sense to stay away. I'm just here for supplies, Grace said, keeping her voice steady. Supplies you're buying with what money? Oh, let me guess. Vernon's eyes slid to Wyatt. You found yourself a new meal ticket already. That was fast. Wyatt moved between them in one smooth motion. Watch your mouth, Holloway. Or what? You going to defend her honor? Vernon's laugh was ugly and harsh. She's here to marry Thomas Ashford. She doesn't have any honor to defend. She never met him. Wyatt said, his voice deadly quiet. She was deceived by his letters. Same as everyone else he lied to. Blood's blood, debt's debt, Vernon spat on the floor. Far as I'm concerned, she owes every person Thomas swindled. And if she's living at your place, that means you're covering for her. Makes you as bad as she is, Mama. Emma's voice was small and frightened. Grace's hands clenched into fist, but before she could speak, Wyatt took another step forward, and his voice dropped to something dangerous. Listen to me carefully, Holloway. You got a problem with Thomas Ashford's debts. That's between you and a dead man. But this woman and her child are under my protection now. You say one more word against them, and you'll answer to me. Understood. Your protection, Vernon sneered. That's supposed to scare me. It should. The two men stared at each other, tension crackling like lightning. Finally, Vernon stepped back, but his expression promised this wasn't over. You're making a mistake, Brennan. The whole town knows it. You're letting poison under your roof, and it's going to rot you from the inside out. He turned and walked out, letting the door slam behind him. The store was silent. Every person in it had heard the exchange, and Grace felt shame burn through her like acid. This was what she'd brought to Wyatt's door. Trouble, gossip, hatred. Helen finished packing the supplies, her face carefully neutral. That'll be $4.30. Wyatt paid, gathered the parcels, and gestured for Grace to follow. They walked out in silence, loaded the wagon, and climbed up. As they drove out of town, Grace finally found her voice. I'm so sorry. For what? For that. For putting you in that position. For making you defend me. Didn't make me do anything. Wyatt's voice was firm. I did it because Holloway's an ass and needed to be told so. But he's right. Being associated with me is going to cause you nothing but trouble. Wyatt pulled the wagon to a stop right there in the middle of the road and turned to face her. You listen to me. Vernon Holloway is a bitter man who's been looking for someone to blame for his failures since long before Thomas Ashford came along. You're not poison. You're a woman who married wrong and paid the price for it. That doesn't make you less. That doesn't make you unworthy. And anyone who says different can go to hell. But the town can think what it wants. I don't live my life for Copper Ridge's approval, and neither should you. Emma was crying softly. Grace pulled her close, kissed her head. You're going to regret this, Grace said quietly. Helping me. You are going to regret it. Let me worry about what I regret. Wyatt snapped the reins and the wagon started moving again. But as they rode back toward the ranch, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That Wyatt's protection, offered so fiercely in that store, had drawn a line in the sand. The town would see her as his now, and that meant any hatred directed at her would splash onto him as well. She'd never wanted that. Never wanted to drag someone else down into the pit Thomas had dug. But it was too late now. The damage was done. That night, after Emma was asleep, Grace found Wyatt on the porch guitar in his hands. She sat down beside him without asking. Play me that sad song, she said. The one you play when you think no one's listening. His fingers found the strings, and the melody drifted out into the cold night, haunting, beautiful, full of grief and gentle hope. When he finished, Grace said what she'd been thinking all evening. I should leave. Come spring like we agreed, maybe sooner. Why? Because staying is selfish. Because every day I'm here, I'm making your life harder. Because I don't want to be the reason you lose everything. You still don't think you deserve this. Wyatt's voice was quiet but certain. You still don't think you deserve kindness or help or a place to rest. Maybe I don't, and maybe you're wrong. He set the guitar aside. You know what I think? I think you're so used to being told you're not enough that you've started believing it. I think Thomas Ashford spent God knows how long convincing women through his letters that they were worthless without him. And I think you're still letting him win. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I don't know how to stop. You start by staying. You start by letting someone care about you without punishing yourself for it. His voice softened. You start by believing that maybe, just maybe, you deserve better than you got. Do you? She asked. Do you believe you deserve better? The question caught him off guard. He was quiet for a long time. No, he admitted finally. I don't. But that doesn't mean I'm right. Maybe we're both wrong. Maybe we both deserve more than we think we do. Grace looked at him, really looked, and saw not the cold, distant rancher she'd first met, but a man as wounded and scared as she was. A man who'd offered her everything he had left to give, not because he expected anything in return, but because he couldn't stand to see someone else suffer the way Rachel had suffered. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for not giving up. Same to you." They sat together in the cold, neither one touching, but closer than they'd been before. Two damaged souls trying to figure out if healing was even possible. If people like them, people who'd lost so much, could ever find their way back to something whole. Inside, the fire crackled. The wind sang through the prairie grass. And somewhere in the darkness, hope flickered like a candle that refused to go out. Fragile and fierce and impossibly stubborn. Winter was coming. The hard times weren't over. But for now, in this moment, they had shelter. They had each other. And sometimes that was enough to keep going. Sometimes that was everything. The barn smelled of hay and leather and horse sweat, familiar scents that had become oddly comforting to Grace over the past month. She was searching for a chisel Wyatt needed to repair a fence post, digging through an old wooden crate in the corner, when her fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. Paper, thick and folded. She pulled it out carefully. An envelope yellowed with age, the corners soft from handling. The address was written in careful script. Mrs. Rachel Brennan, Cheyenne, Wyoming. The return address made Grace's blood run cold. Thomas Ashford, Copper Ridge, Montana Territory. She turned it over. The seal had been broken long ago. The postmark read March 1882, 3 months before Rachel died. Grace's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter inside. The words were brief, businesslike, chilling in their casualness. "Mrs. Brennan, your husband doesn't need to know about our arrangement. The payment will be made as promised, delivered to the address you provided. Destroy this after reading. Discretion is essential for both our sakes. T." Grace read it twice, 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Rachel had been corresponding with Thomas Ashford, had some kind of arrangement with him, an arrangement she kept secret from Wyatt. She stood there in the dim barn dust motes, floating in the shafts of light through the gaps in the boards, and felt the foundation of everything she thought she understood begin to crack. "Wyatt." She called out, her voice not quite steady. "Wyatt, I need you to see something." He came immediately, reading the urgency in her tone. He was wiping grease from his hands with a rag, his expression shifting from concern to confusion when he saw what she held. "What is it?" Grace handed him the letter without speaking. She watched his face as he read, watched the color drain from his weathered cheeks, watched his jaw clench so tight she could see the muscle jumping, watched something break behind his eyes. "Where did you find this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "In that crate. I was looking for the chisel you needed, and I just found it." Wyatt read the letter again, then a third time, as if hoping the words would change. They didn't. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Rachel never mentioned Thomas Ashford, never mentioned Montana. We were planning to stay in Wyoming, build our life there." "What kind of arrangement could they have had?" Grace asked gently. Wyatt shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Rachel worked as a clerk at the land office in Cheyenne. She handled property records transfers, that kind of thing. Maybe Thomas needed some kind of legal document. But why the secrecy? Why tell her not to let you know?" Wyatt's hands clenched on the paper. "I don't know." But Grace could see in his eyes that he was beginning to suspect, beginning to piece together something he didn't want to be true. "Wyatt," she said carefully, "you told me Rachel died in a robbery, that you tracked the man responsible, but he got away." "That's right. There was a stagecoach holdup outside Cheyenne. Rachel was on it coming back from visiting her sister. 3 people died. The bandits got away with nearly $10,000 from a bank shipment, and you became a marshal to find them. I was already a deputy. After Rachel died, I took the case personally. Spent 5 years following every lead, every rumor, finally tracked it to Montana to Thomas Ashford. But before I could arrest him, he was already dead. Or so I thought." Grace watched understanding dawn across his face like a sunrise nobody wanted to see. "What if it wasn't a random robbery?" she said quietly. "What if Rachel was targeted specifically?" "Why would anyone target Rachel? She was just a clerk who handled land records. Who knew about property transfers, mineral claims, all the valuable information that men like Thomas Ashford could profit from?" Wyatt was shaking his head, but his eyes said he knew she was right. Thomas was running schemes all over the territory. Grace continued. "Mail order bride fraud was just one of them. What if he had other operations? What if he needed inside information from someone at the land office? You're saying Rachel helped him? Wyatt's voice was hollow. I'm saying maybe he manipulated her into helping him without her knowing what she was really doing. Convinced her she was doing something legal, something harmless. And then when she became a liability, when she knew too much, he arranged for her to be silenced. That's not possible. Rachel would never, she wouldn't. Wyatt stopped, closed his eyes, but she was acting strange those last few months. Jumpy, secretive. I thought it was just wedding nerves. Or she was scared. She'd figured out what Thomas really was and didn't know how to tell you. The letter crumpled in Wyatt's fist. He turned and walked out of the barn, moving fast despite his limp. Grace followed Emma's hand in hers, the child having appeared from wherever she'd been playing. Where are you going? Grace called. To find answers. Wyatt, wait. But he was already at the house, striding inside with purpose. Grace hurried after him. She found him pulling a trunk from beneath his bed, throwing it open. Inside were papers, files, maps. Everything he'd collected during his 5 years as a marshal hunting Rachel's killers. He spread them across the table, his hands moving with controlled fury. Grace recognized some of the documents. Witness statements from the robbery, maps of the holdup location, sketches of suspected bandits. Wyatt pulled out a ledger, flipped through pages covered in his own handwriting. Names, dates, connections. A web of crime that spread across 3 territories. Look, he said, stabbing his finger at an entry. June 1882, 3 months after Rachel died, Thomas Ashford purchased 2,000 acres of mineral-rich land outside Helena. Paid cash, $20,000. I always wondered where he got that kind of money. From the bank robbery, Grace whispered. From the bank robbery that killed my fiancée. Wyatt's voice was dangerous now, cold and sharp. He used Rachel to get information about which stagecoaches were carrying money. Then he had her killed to cover his tracks. And he got away with it. He slammed the ledger shut. For 5 years I thought he was dead. Thought my chance for justice died with him. But if there's any possibility he's still alive if he faked his death, like we suspect, then I'm going to find him. And this time, I'm going to make sure he pays for what he did. Grace laid her hand on his arm. We'll find him together. Wyatt looked at her, and for a moment she saw past the anger to the grief beneath. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is. Thomas destroyed both our lives. He lied to me, used me, left me to take the blame for his debts. And if what we suspect is true, he killed the woman you loved. That makes it my fight too. Before Wyatt could respond, there was a knock at the door. Sharp, urgent. They exchanged glances. Wyatt moved to answer it, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Dr. Henry Shaw stood on the porch, his medical bag in hand, his face grave. Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Winters, I'm glad you're both here. I have news, and I'm not sure if it's good or troubling. Come in, Dr. Wyatt said, stepping aside. Dr. Shaw entered, removing his hat. He nodded politely to Grace, smiled at Emma, who was watching from the corner. Then he turned to Wyatt. I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about Thomas Ashford's death. You asked if I'd personally identified the body. I did. The truth is, I didn't. Dr. Shaw's voice was troubled. Sheriff Porter brought the body to me, told me it was Thomas, said there'd been a wagon accident. The body was badly burned, face unrecognizable. I examined it, confirmed death, wrote the certificate, but I never actually verified the identity. I took the sheriff's word. Wyatt and Grace exchanged looks. Why are you telling us this now? Wyatt asked. Because I saw Thomas Ashford yesterday. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. That's impossible, Grace breathed. I thought so too, but I was in Billings on business, stopped at a restaurant, and I saw a man who looked exactly like Thomas. Same height, same build, same way of moving. He was calling himself William Thompson, said he ran a matrimonial agency helping Eastern women find Western husbands. Dr. Shaw pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Wyatt. Golden West Matrimonial Bureau. Wyatt read aloud. William Thompson, proprietor, San Francisco office. I could be wrong, Dr. Shaw said, but the resemblance was uncanny. And given what you've told me about the irregularities around his death, I thought you should know. After the doctor left, Wyatt and Grace sat at the table in silence, the business card between them. San Francisco, Grace said finally. That's where the letters were postmarked. The ones he sent to me. Same location the telegram mentioned in the bank records. Wyatt tapped the card. Package ready for pickup. The package was probably stolen money moved through his matrimonial fraud operation. So he's alive, running the same schemes under a new name. Looks that way. Wyatt stood, began pacing. We need proof, real proof. If I go to the authorities with just a business card and a doctor's suspicion, they'll laugh me out of the office. Then we get proof, Grace said. We find other victims, women he defrauded. We build a case. We don't even know how many women he's contacted. But I do know someone who might, Grace said slowly. Someone who answered the same kind of advertisement I did. The door opened and a young woman stepped into the boarding house parlor where Grace and Mrs. Caldwell were taking tea. She was perhaps 23 with auburn hair and pale skin, and she was visibly pregnant, maybe 5 months along. Mrs. Caldwell, the woman said in a soft Irish accent, I'm looking for Thomas Ashford. I was told in town he lived near here. Grace's teacup froze halfway to her lips. Thomas Ashford is dead, Mrs. Caldwell said gently. Has been about 2 months now. The woman's face crumpled. But he can't be. He sent for me. He said we'd marry in the spring. He said he had a ranch, a home ready. She pulled letters from her bag, and Grace recognized the handwriting immediately. The same careful script that had written to her. My name is Margaret Flynn, the woman said, tears starting. But everyone calls me Maggie. I came all the way from Boston. Thomas said he'd send money for the journey, but it never came, so I used what little I had saved. And now you're telling me he's dead? Grace set down her cup and stood. Miss Flynn, please sit down. I think you and I need to talk. Over the next hour, the full scope of Thomas's operation became clear. Maggie had received letters for 6 months, each one more promising than the last. She'd sent him $50 as a good faith deposit on wedding arrangements. She'd left her job, her family, everything to come west. And she wasn't alone. I met 2 other women on the train, Maggie said, wiping her eyes. Both coming to Montana to meet men they'd been corresponding with. One was going to Butte, another to Helena. We compared letters and her voice dropped. They were almost identical. Same promises, same phrases, just different names signed at the bottom. Grace pulled out her own letters from Thomas. She and Maggie laid them side by side on the table. The similarities were unmistakable. Whole paragraphs repeated word for word. Mrs. Caldwell leaned over to look. Good Lord, this is an organized fraud. How many women do you suppose he contacted? Dozens, Grace said grimly, maybe more. And if he's alive in San Francisco running the same operation under a new name, he's still doing it. Maggie looked up sharply. What do you mean if he's alive? You said he was dead. That's what we were told. But there's evidence he faked his death. Grace explained about Dr. Shaw's sighting about the matrimonial bureau in San Francisco. Maggie listened with growing horror. So I'm not a widow. I'm just a fool who gave her last money to a criminal. You're a victim, Grace said firmly. Same as me. Same as all the other women he lied to. Maggie's hands went to her swollen belly. I'm going to have his child, and he's not even dead. He's out there somewhere, probably laughing at how stupid I was. No, Wyatt said from the doorway. All 3 women turned. He'd been listening from the hall. He's out there running the same con on new victims, which means we can catch him, if you're willing to help. Over the next 2 weeks, Wyatt, Grace, and Maggie worked to build their case. Mrs. Caldwell used her connections to contact women's aid societies in other cities asking about mail-order bride fraud. The responses came back troubling. At least 7 women had reported being swindled by a Montana rancher just in their region over the past 2 years, but Agent Miller suspected there were many more across other territories. 3 had lost money, 2 had traveled west only to find their intended husband didn't exist. 1 had been abandoned pregnant, exactly like Maggie. The pattern was clear. Thomas would correspond with multiple women simultaneously. Promise each one marriage and security, request money for various expenses, then either disappear or die conveniently before the wedding. He's been doing this for years, Wyatt said, spreading the letters across his table, rotating through towns, using different names. When things got too hot in one location, he'd stage his death and move on. And no one stopped him because his victims were too ashamed to report it, Grace added. Women traveling west to marry strangers aren't exactly sympathized with by law enforcement. That's going to change, Wyatt said grimly. We're going to the territorial marshal. With this much evidence, they'll have to investigate. But before they could act, Vernon Holloway made his move. It started with whispers. Grace heard them when she went to town with Emma for supplies. Saw you got another one staying out at Brennan's place now. That Irish girl. How many Thomas Ashford brides is he going to collect? Then came the public meeting. Vernon organized it at the saloon, invited every man in town who'd lost money to Thomas. Nearly 30 people showed up. Grace and Wyatt heard about it from Dr. Shaw, who'd attended out of concern. Vernon's stirring them up, the doctor warned, telling them that you, Mrs. Winters and Miss Flynn, are here to scam more money out of the town. That Wyatt's protecting you because he's been taken in by a confidence scheme. That's insane, Grace said. Doesn't matter, Dr. Shaw's face was grim. He's got people believing it, and he's talking about taking action. What kind of action? Wyatt asked. The kind that involves torches and rope. That night, Wyatt moved Maggie to the ranch. She arrived pale and frightened, her few belongings in a carpet bag. I'm so sorry, she told Grace. I brought you nothing but trouble. You've brought us another witness, Grace corrected. Another piece of evidence. Thomas victimized you just like he victimized me. They put Maggie in the small room off the kitchen. Emma was delighted to have another woman in the house chattering away about the horses in the barn and all the things Mr. Wyatt had taught her. But the peace didn't last long. 2 days later, Grace took Emma into town. It was a bright December morning, cold but clear. They needed fabric for a winter coat for Emma. The dress shop was the only place in Copper Ridge that sold what they needed. Grace steeled herself for rejection, but to her surprise, the seamstress served her. Coldly, with obvious reluctance, but she measured Emma and Nola and sold them the fabric. Grace paid and was turning to leave when she heard the commotion outside. A group of young men stood in the street, 6 or 7 of them all in their early 20s. Grace recognized Vernon Holloway's son Dale among them. They'd clearly been drinking despite the early hour. Well, look here, Dale called out when he saw Grace. It's the mail order bride. Where's your friend? The Irish one, she's joining Brennan's collection too. Grace kept her head down, tried to walk past, but Dale stepped into her path. What's your hurry? We just want to ask some questions. Like how much Thomas Ashford paid you to come here and play the grieving widow. How much Brennan's paying you now to warm his bed. My mother is not bad, Emma said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the cruel laughter. You're being mean. The little bastard's got a mouth on her, one of the other men said. Grace's hands clenched. Don't you dare call her that. Why not? Dale leered. That's what she'll be known as around here. The daughter of a whore and a dead con man. Emma began to cry. Grace pulled her close, tried to push past the men. But they surrounded her now, a circle of hostile faces and alcohol breath. Please, Grace said, let us pass. Answer the question first. How much is Brennan paying you? He's not paying me anything. We're just... Grace stopped, realized nothing she said would matter. That's when the rock flew. Grace never saw who threw it. It came from behind, from someone in the growing crowd that had gathered to watch. A stone the size of a hen's egg thrown hard. It struck Emma on the side of the head just above her ear. The child's cry was sharp and terrible. Grace caught her as she stumbled, felt warm blood instantly soaking into Emma's blonde hair. The world seemed to slow down, sound becoming muffled and distant. Emma Grace gasped. Oh God, Emma. Emma was conscious but dazed, blood streaming down her face. Grace pressed her hand to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, and when she pulled it away, her palm was red. The crowd had gone silent. Even Dale looked shocked, taking a step back. Who threw that? Grace demanded, looking around at the faces. Who hurt my child? No one answered. You cowards, Grace hissed. You spineless, pathetic cowards. She's 6 years old. Whatever you think of me, whatever debt you think I owe, she's innocent. She's a child. Maybe you should have thought about that before you came back here, someone called from the back of the crowd. Maybe you should have stayed gone. Grace didn't wait to hear more. She scooped Emma into her arms and ran half stumbling toward Dr. Shaw's office at the edge of town. Emma was crying, confused and frightened, blood dripping onto Grace's dress. The doctor's door was locked. Grace pounded on it with her free hand. Dr. Shaw, please, please help. The door opened and Dr. Shaw's eyes widened when he saw the blood. What happened? Someone threw a rock. She's hurt. He ushered them inside quickly, settling Emma on his examination table. Grace hovered beside her daughter, holding her hand while Dr. Shaw cleaned the wound. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said after a moment. "Head wounds bleed heavily, but the cut's shallow. She'll have a bruise and possibly a small scar, but she'll be fine." Relief made Grace's knees weak. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Dr. Shaw bandaged Emma's head, then looked at Grace with something like pity. "Who did this? I don't know. Someone in the crowd outside the saloon. They were saying awful things, and then someone threw a rock. This has to stop." Dr. Shaw's voice was heavy. "You need to leave Copper Ridge, Grace. This town has turned against you, and it's not going to get better. Vernon Holloway's been spreading poison for weeks now. People are listening because they want someone to blame." Grace paid him with what little money she had left and carried Emma back to the wagon. The child had stopped crying, but was quiet in that awful way children get when the world has hurt them too much. They were halfway back to the ranch when Wyatt met them on the road riding hard. He must have seen them from a distance, must have known something was wrong from the way Grace hunched over the reins. He pulled up beside the wagon, saw Emma's bandaged head and the blood on Grace's dress. His face went white, then dark with fury. "What happened?" Grace told him, the words coming out flat and dead. When she finished, Wyatt sat very still in his saddle. Then without a word, he turned his horse toward town. "No," Grace said sharply. "Wyatt, don't. They hurt Emma." "I know. But going there now like this, that's exactly what they want. Proof that I've corrupted you, turned you into someone violent. I don't care what they want." "Well, I do." Grace's voice broke. "This is my fault. I came here. I brought this trouble to your door. And now a child's been hurt because of me. I won't let you destroy yourself for my sake." Wyatt's hands were white-knuckled on the reins. After a long moment, he nodded once and turned his horse back toward the ranch. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Grace found Wyatt in the barn cleaning his rifle. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Getting ready for what Vernon's not going to stop. You know that. He's worked people into a frenzy, and it's only going to get worse. So I'm getting ready for when they come." Grace felt ice in her stomach. "You really think they'll come here?" "I know they will." "Then maybe I should leave. Take Emma and Maggie and go tonight before anyone else gets hurt." Wyatt set down the rifle and turned to face her. "We already had this conversation. You're not leaving. Your home could burn. Your animals could be killed. You could be killed. Then we'll deal with it. But I won't deal with losing you." The words hung in the cold barn air. Wyatt Grace started. "No. Listen to me, Bao. I lost Rachel because I didn't see the danger until it was too late. I'm not making that mistake again. Whatever's coming, we face it together." Understood. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to protect him from the storm she'd brought. But she could see in his eyes that arguing was pointless. Together, she agreed quietly. They didn't have to wait long. The attack came 3 nights later, just after midnight. Grace woke to the sound of horses, many of them approaching fast. Wyatt was already up, rifle in hand, moving to the window. "Get Emma and Maggie," he said quietly. "Sell her. Now." Grace didn't argue. She woke both of them quickly, urgently. Maggie was groggy and confused. Emma whimpered when Grace pulled her from sleep, her bandaged head a white blur in the darkness. "Mama Grace, what's happening?" "We need to go downstairs, sweetheart. Right now." Grace herded them toward the trap door in the kitchen floor, while Wyatt positioned himself at the front window. Outside, torches were visible now, bobbing in the darkness like malevolent fireflies. A voice called out, "Brennan, we need to talk." "Vernon Holloway." "Then talk from there," Wyatt called back, not opening the door. "This has gone far enough. You've made your point. But it's time for these women to leave tonight. Peacefully. They're not going anywhere." "Then you're a fool. We tried to warn you, tried to give you a chance to see reason. But you chose them over your own people. That makes you as guilty as they are." Guilty of what Wyatt's voice was hard. Showing basic human decency, guilty of harboring criminals. Guilty of betraying everyone who ever called you friend. Guilty of throwing away your reputation for women who'll leave you the first chance they get. Grace flinched at the words, even though she knew they weren't true. Or were they? Would she have stayed if Wyatt hadn't insisted? "Last chance, Brennan. Send them out or we'll come in and get them. Touch this door and I'll shoot the first man through it." There was a long pause. Then Vernon's voice again colder now. So be it, boys, light it up. The first torch arced through the air in a beautiful, terrible parabola. It landed on the roof with a heavy thump, and flames immediately began licking across the dry wooden shingles. Wyatt fired a warning shot through the window. The riders scattered, but another torch flew, hitting the side of the cabin. Then another, the cellar, Wyatt shouted, now. Grace was already climbing down, Emma in her arms, Maggie right behind. Wyatt fired twice more, then dropped through the trapdoor and slammed it shut above them. The cellar was small and dark, lit only by the lantern Wyatt grabbed and lit with shaking hands. Above them, they could hear the crackle of flames, the shouts of men, the crash of something heavy falling. The tunnel, Wyatt said, moving to the back wall. He shoved aside a shelf to reveal a narrow opening. Go, I'll be right behind you. Grace didn't hesitate. She crawled into the tunnel first, Emma pressed against her chest. The space was barely wide enough for an adult, the ceiling so low she had to move on her hands and knees. Behind her, she could hear Maggie's frightened breathing, then Wyatt bringing up the rear. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and old wood. It seemed to go on forever, the darkness absolute, except for the faint glow of Wyatt's lantern behind them. Grace's knees scraped on rocks. Her shoulders brushed the close walls. Emma was crying softly, terrified, and Grace murmured wordless reassurances that even she didn't believe. Keep moving, Wyatt urged. Almost there. Behind them, muffled by earth but unmistakable, came the sound of an explosion. The cabin's roof collapsing, Grace realized. Or maybe the stove overheating and bursting. Everything Wyatt owned, everything he'd built, gone. Then she saw light ahead. Real light, moonlight. The tunnel exit. She crawled faster, desperate to get Emma out to breathe clean air. She emerged beside a creek, gasping, pulling Emma out after her. Maggie came next, then Wyatt, who immediately turned to look back the way they'd come. Smoke poured from the tunnel entrance. And in the distance, perhaps a quarter-mile away, flames lit up the night sky. Wyatt's cabin was a torch burning so bright it turned the darkness into day. They stood there on the creek bank, all four of them, watching everything burn. Emma buried her face in Grace's shoulder. Maggie wept quietly. Wyatt's face was carved from stone, showing nothing, but Grace could see his hands shaking. I'm so sorry, Grace sobbed. Oh God, Wyatt, I'm so sorry. You're home. Everything. It's just wood, Wyatt said, but his voice was hollow. We're alive. That's what matters. But Grace could see the devastation on his face as he watched his home burn. The home he'd shared with Rachel's memory. The home he'd built with his own hands. All of it gone because of her. We need to move, Wyatt said, pulling himself together with visible effort. They might come looking. We need to get to Dr. Shaw's house. They made their way through the darkness, stumbling over rough ground. Emma was too heavy for Grace to carry far, so Wyatt took her, settling the child on his shoulders despite his limp. Behind them, the fire continued to burn, a beacon of hatred visible for miles. When they finally reached Dr. Shaw's house on the edge of town, the old doctor took one look at them and ushered them inside without a word. Vern Holloway, he asked. Wyatt nodded. Jesus. Dr. Shaw ran a hand through his white hair. This is attempted murder, not just harassment. Will Sheriff Porter do anything about it? Grace asked, already knowing the answer. Probably not. Not unless we can prove it was deliberate arson. And good luck getting anyone to testify against Vernon. Dr. Shaw looked at them with deep sympathy. You can stay here tonight, but you need to think seriously about what comes next. This won't end until someone breaks. I should go, Grace whispered. I should take Emma and Maggie and just disappear. No, Wyatt said. Absolute final. We already had this conversation. You're not leaving. Your house just burned down because of, my house burned down because Vernon Holloway is a criminal and the law won't stop him. That's not on you. Wyatt turned to face her fully. Listen to me. Vernon wanted you gone. He wanted to scare you away. If you leave now, he wins. He learns that violence works, that he can burn down anyone who disagrees with him. I won't give him that satisfaction, and neither will you. Then what do we do? Grace's voice broke. We have nothing left. We have each other. Wyatt's voice was fierce. We have Emma and Maggie. We have the land. They can't burn that. And we have the truth. That's more than nothing. Dr. Shaw cleared his throat. There might be another option. The land office. If Wyatt transfers part of his property to you, Grace, then you're not just a guest or a dependent. You're a landowner. That gives you legal standing protection under territorial law. Grace stared at him. I can't ask him to do that. You're not asking. Wyatt's expression was determined. Tomorrow we go to the land office. I transfer 10 acres to you, enough for a paddock and a stable. You become a property owner, a taxpayer, someone the law has to acknowledge. And then we rebuild. Together. Wyatt, that's everything. That's your future, your security. My future is standing right here, he said quietly. Everything else is details. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Grace looked at this man who'd lost his home defending her, who'd stood between her and a mob who was now offering her a piece of his land, his legacy without hesitation. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be chosen. Not tolerated, not pitied, but genuinely chosen by someone who saw all her flaws and scars and chose her anyway. Okay, she whispered. Tomorrow we go to the land office. The next morning they walked into Copper Ridge together. Grace's dress was still stained with soot and Emma's blood. Wyatt's coat smelled of smoke. But they walked with their heads high, Emma between them, holding both their hands. The land office was quiet. Edgar Moss looked up from his ledgers with surprise when they entered. Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Winters, I heard about the fire. Terrible business. It was arson, Mr. Moss. Wyatt laid out his intent clearly and firmly. And I'm here to make sure something good comes from it. I want to transfer a portion of my ranch to Mrs. Grace Winters. 10 acres including the south paddock and space for a stable. Edgar adjusted his spectacles nervously. Mr. Brennan, I'm not sure this is wise. Mrs. Winters' reputation in town is well complicated. I don't care about reputations. Can you do it or not? Legally, yes, but people might see this as Edgar struggled for words, as what I choose to do with my own property. Wyatt's voice was firm. Now, are you going to help us, or do I need to ride to Helena and find a land office that will... Edgar sighed and pulled out the necessary forms. It took an hour of paperwork, signatures, and official stamps. But when they walked out of that office, Grace held a deed in her hands with her name on it. Grace Ann Winters, sole owner of 10 acres in Montana Territory, including all buildings, improvements, and water rights thereon. She owned land, real land. For the first time in her life, she had something that was truly hers, something no one could take away. I don't know what to say, she whispered, staring at the document. Don't say anything. Wyatt's hand found hers. Just don't give up on it. On us. This is your stake in the future we're building. Our future. They were halfway back to Dr. Shaw's house when they heard the commotion. A crowd had gathered in the town square, and at its center stood Vernon Holloway, holding court like some kind of frontier judge. We can go around, Dr. Shaw suggested quietly. But Wyatt was already moving toward the crowd, his expression set. No more hiding. The crowd parted as they approached, whispers spreading like wildfire. Vernon saw them and his face twisted with fury. Well, well, the rats survived. We survived your attempted murder, if that's what you mean. Wyatt's voice carried across the square. You burned my home to the ground with women and a child inside. That's not justice, Holloway. That's criminal. Criminal, Vernon spat. You're the one harboring thieves. You made your choice, Brennan. Don't cry about the consequences. The consequences of showing basic human decency, of refusing to punish someone for her dead husband's sins. Wyatt's voice rang out. Look at yourselves, all of you. You're so busy nursing grudges that you've forgotten what it means to be decent people. A child was assaulted, a home was burned, and you're standing here acting like it's justified. Thomas Ashford stole from us, someone shouted from the crowd. Thomas Ashford is dead, Wyatt shot back. He's been dead for months, and this woman had nothing to do with his schemes. She was his victim as much as any of you. She's living off your charity, Vernon sneered, taking advantage of your guilt over Rachel. The words hit like a physical blow. Wyatt went very still, and Grace felt him start to pull away to retreat behind his walls. But she squeezed his hand tight and stepped forward. You want to know the truth? Grace's voice shook but carried clear. Yes, I'm Thomas Ashford's mail-order bride. Yes, I came here with nothing. And yes, Mr. Brennan offered me shelter when every single one of you turned your backs. He did that not because I deserved it, but because he's a better person than any of you have proven to be. You don't get to lecture us, Vernon started, But Grace cut him off. I'm not done. You want to hate me? Fine. Hate me for being naive enough to believe a con man's letters. Hate me for not seeing through Thomas's schemes, and hate me for surviving when good people lost money. But my daughter is 6 years old. She never hurt anyone. She never stole anything. And one of you threw a rock at her head because you couldn't stand that she existed. What kind of people does that make you? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others stared at their feet. And last night, Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. You burned a good man's home because he refused to throw us out to freeze. You tried to kill us, and now you're standing here acting like you're the victims, like you're the ones who've been wronged. You don't understand what we lost, a woman called out. Helen Whitaker, Grace realized. Don't I? Grace's laugh was bitter. I lost everything. My home, my reputation, any chance at a normal life. I lost the man I thought I'd married, not to death, but to the realization that he'd never existed in the first place. I came here with one dress and a starving child begging for a chance, and you couldn't even give me that. Tears streamed down her face now, but she didn't stop. So yes, I understand loss. But I also understand that at some point you have to decide whether you're going to spend the rest of your life drowning in bitterness or whether you're going to try to be better. Mr. Brennan chose to be better. He chose to help someone even when it cost him everything. That doesn't make him weak or foolish. It makes him the only one of you with any real courage. The silence that fell was profound. Grace stood there trembling, waiting for the backlash for the anger. But it didn't come. Instead, Mrs. Judith Caldwell stepped forward from the crowd. She's right, the boarding house owner said quietly. We've been letting our anger turn us into something ugly. Thomas Ashford was a thief and a liar. But burning a man's home, hurting a child, that's not justice. That's just more evil. Stay out of this, Vernon warned. No, Mrs. Caldwell's voice grew firmer. I won't. I lost money too, Vernon. $200 I'll never see again. But I'm not about to let that turn me into someone who condones attempted murder. What you did last night was wrong, and I'm ashamed I didn't speak up sooner. Another voice joined hers. Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith. I'm with Judith. This has gone too far. If we're going to call ourselves a civilized town, we need to act like it. We let one widow slide, and soon every grifter in the territory will come running here, Vernon argued. Then we deal with grifters when they come, Fletcher said. But Grace Winters isn't her husband, and I'm done pretending otherwise. He turned to face the crowd. Anyone else tired of letting Vernon Holloway speak for all of us? Slowly, hesitantly, others began to nod. Not everyone. There were still plenty of hard faces, plenty of crossed arms, and suspicious glares. But enough. Enough to shift the balance. Sheriff Clayton Porter, who'd been standing at the edge of the crowd, finally stepped forward. Vernon Holloway, I'm placing you under arrest for arson and attempted murder. Vernon's face went purple. You can't be serious. I know a man's home burned down last night with people inside. I know there are witnesses who saw you and your boys with torches. And I know that whatever grudge you're nursing doesn't give you the right to commit murder. Porter's voice was heavy, reluctant, but firm. You've crossed a line, Vernon. This time I can't look the other way. For a moment it looked like Vernon might fight. His hand moved toward his belt, and Wyatt tensed beside Grace. But then Dale Holloway, Vernon's own son, stepped forward and pulled his father back. Pa, don't. It's over. Boy, you don't know what Vernon started. It's over, Dale repeated. And there was something broken in his voice. We went too far. We could have killed them. Could have killed that little girl. For what money that's been gone for years, I can't. I won't be part of this anymore. Vernon stared at his son like he was looking at a stranger. Then slowly the fight went out of him. Sheriff Porter moved in with handcuffs, and the crowd watched in stunned silence as Vernon Holloway was led away, still muttering about justice and betrayal. After he was gone, the crowd began to disperse, people drifting away in small groups, talking in low voices. Some still looked angry, others looked ashamed, but the immediate threat was gone, diffused by the simple act of people choosing to speak up. Mrs. Caldwell approached Grace hesitantly. Mrs. Winters, I owe you an apology. I should have helped you that first day. Should have stood up for you long before now. I was afraid of losing business, afraid of being ostracized. But that's no excuse. Thank you, Grace said quietly. It means more than you know. I have rooms available at the boarding house, free of charge until you and Mr. Brennan can rebuild. That's very kind. Mrs. Caldwell smiled sadly. It's the least I can do. Over the next days, something shifted in Copper Ridge. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. Plenty of people still avoided Grace, still whispered behind their hands. But the open hostility faded, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, people began to help. Tom Fletcher offered his forge to repair tools needed for rebuilding. Helen Whitaker quietly told Dr. Shaw she'd extend credit to Grace if needed. Even some of the men who'd stood with Vernon came forward, shamefaced offering labor. Doesn't make up for what they did? Wyatt said one evening as they sat on Mrs. Caldwell's porch watching Emma play in the yard. No, Grace agreed. But it's a start. You were right, about choosing to be better. She looked at him. So were you, about me deserving more than I thought I did. I'm starting to believe it. Good. Wyatt took her hand. Because you do. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the prairie. Winter was settling in hard now, but there was warmth between them that had nothing to do with temperature. A week later, the telegram arrived. Dr. Shaw brought it to Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house early in the morning, his face grave. This came for you, Mr. Brennan, from the U.S. Marshal Service. Wyatt opened it, read quickly. His expression shifted from surprise to grim satisfaction. Thomas Ashford, spotted in San Francisco, working under alias William Thompson. Operates marriage agency. Come quick. Agent Miller. Grace read over his shoulder. It's really him. Looks that way. Wyatt folded the telegram carefully. Miller's an old colleague from my Marshal days. If he says it's Thomas, it's Thomas. We have to go, Grace said. We have to stop him before he victimizes more women. Agreed. Wyatt looked at her steadily. But it's a long journey and dangerous. You don't have to come. Yes, I do. Grace's voice was firm. This is my fight, too. Thomas destroyed my life. He destroyed yours. He's still out there destroying other women's lives. I'm not letting him get away with it. What about Emma? She stays here with Mrs. Caldwell and Maggie. She'll be safe. Grace. Wyatt started. Don't try to protect me from this. I need to see him face justice. I need to look him in the eye and show him that he didn't break me. Wyatt studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, together then. They left for San Francisco 2 days later, boarding the train in Billings with enough money borrowed from Dr. Shaw and Mrs. Caldwell to cover passage. Emma cried when they said goodbye, but Mrs. Caldwell held her close, promising stories and cookies and all the love a 6-year-old could need. I'll be back soon, sweetheart, Grace promised. And when I come back, we'll never have to run again. The train journey took 4 days. Grace and Wyatt sat across from each other in the passenger car, watching the landscape change from prairie to mountains to desert to coast. They talked little, both lost in their own thoughts. Grace thought about Thomas Ashford and the letters that had seemed so sincere. She thought about Emma and the life she wanted to give her. She thought about Wyatt and the way he looked at her sometimes like she was something precious he was afraid to break. And she thought about justice, about making Thomas pay not just for what he'd done to her, but for all the women he'd victimized. For Rachel, for Maggie, for the dozens of others they might never know about. The train pulled into San Francisco on a gray morning fog rolling in from the bay. The city was enormous, chaotic, nothing like the small towns Grace had known. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high. Cable cars clanged up steep hills. The streets teemed with people speaking a dozen different languages. They made their way to the address on Agent Miller's telegram. A small office near the waterfront U.S. Marshal Service stenciled on the frosted glass door. Caleb Miller was a man in his early 40s, lean and hard with observant eyes. He greeted Wyatt with a firm handshake and a smile. Brennan, been a long time. Too long. Wyatt introduced Grace. This is Mrs. Grace Winters, one of Thomas Ashford's victims. Miller tipped his hat to her. Ma'am, I'm sorry for what you've been through, but I'm glad you're here. We're going to need you. He spread a map across his desk marked with several X symbols. Thomas is operating out of an office on Montgomery Street, he explained. Golden West Matrimonial Bureau. Front for his mail-order bride fraud. He's got advertisements running in newspapers across the East Coast. Women come to him, pay fees, send money for supposed wedding arrangements. Then the men they're supposed to marry either don't exist or conveniently die before the wedding. How many women? Grace asked. We've documented at least 20 in the past year, probably more we don't know about. Grace felt sick. 20 women. 20 lives disrupted, money stolen, hopes destroyed. We need to catch him in the act, Miller continued. Get evidence that will hold up in court. I've got surveillance on his office, but we need more. We need someone to go in undercover pose as a potential bride. He looked at Grace. Mrs. Winters, I know this is asking a lot, but you're the only one who can do this. You know how he operates. You know what to look for. I'll do it, Grace said without hesitation. Wyatt started to object, but she cut him off. I need to do this, for myself, for Emma, for all the other women. The plan was simple. Grace would visit Thomas's office, posing as Rebecca Hayes, a widow from Philadelphia, seeking a new husband in the West. She'd wear different clothes, change her hair, hope that Thomas wouldn't recognize her. Wyatt and Miller would be nearby, ready to move in if anything went wrong. The next morning, Grace stood outside the Golden West Matrimonial Bureau, her heart hammering. She'd pinned her hair differently, wore a hat with a veil, dressed in borrowed clothes that made her look more prosperous than she was. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The office was well appointed, leather chairs, polished desk, framed testimonials on the walls. And behind the desk sat Thomas Ashford. He looked different. Clean-shaven hair, neatly trimmed, dressed in an expensive suit. But it was unmistakably him. The same sharp features, the same calculating eyes. Good morning, he said with a warm smile. How may I help you? Grace kept her voice steady. My name is Rebecca Hayes. I'm interested in your matrimonial services. Of course, please sit. Grace sat her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Thomas launched into his pitch. It was smooth practice designed to appeal to a woman's hopes and fears. He showed her letters from supposed successful matches, described kind, hard-working men seeking devoted wives, quoted reasonable fees. Grace listened, recognizing the same promises he'd made to her, to Maggie, to who knew how many others. She felt anger building but kept her expression neutral. This all sounds wonderful, she said. Do you have anyone in particular you'd recommend? Thomas smiled. Actually, I have a rancher in Montana. Fine man, recently widowed, seeking a mature woman to help run his household. He's offering to pay travel expenses and provides a generous settlement. And your fee? $50 to facilitate the introduction. Another $50 upon successful marriage. Very reasonable, I assure you. Grace reached for her reticule as if to get her checkbook. But as she did, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing the small scar on her wrist. Thomas's eyes locked on it. His expression changed instantly, the warm smile freezing, then cracking. You're Grace Winters, he said flatly. Grace's heart stopped. She started to rise, but Thomas was faster. He pulled a derringer from his desk drawer, small but deadly at this range. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize you? Thomas's voice was cold now, all pretense gone. I studied every detail of my prospective brides. That scar, your handwriting, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking. I knew the moment you walked in. Outside, Wyatt saw Thomas pull the gun through the window. He and Miller burst through the door, weapons drawn. Drop it, Ashford, Miller barked. But Thomas had already grabbed Grace, pulling her in front of him. As a shield, the derringer pressed to her side. Stay back or I'll kill her. Wyatt froze his revolver, aimed, but unable to fire without hitting Grace. It's over, Thomas, Miller said. We've got evidence. Witnesses. You can't run from this. Watch me. Thomas dragged Grace backward toward the rear door. She struggled, but he was stronger, the gun digging painfully into her ribs. They burst out into an alley. Thomas pulled Grace toward the street, toward the chaos of San Francisco traffic. If he made it to a crowd, he could disappear, use Grace as a hostage to escape. Wyatt and Miller followed, shouting for police. The chase spilled onto Montgomery Street. Thomas dragged Grace through markets, around cable cars, between buildings. She fought him at every step, making him work for every yard. They reached the ferry building, the massive terminal where boats departed for Oakland and beyond. Thomas hauled Grace toward the docks, clearly planning to force her onto a boat. Stop, Grace screamed. Somebody help! But the crowd just parted, unwilling to get involved. Thomas reached the edge of the dock. Below, dark water churned. Behind, Wyatt was closing in, his face desperate. Thomas hesitated for just a moment, calculating his options. In that instant, Grace made her choice. She went completely limp, dead weight in his arms. Surprised, Thomas loosened his grip for just a second. Grace twisted, elbowed him hard in the ribs, and pulled away. Thomas stumbled off balance at the dock's edge. The Derringer went off the shot going wild, and then he was falling, arms windmilling into the cold San Francisco Bay. Grace collapsed to her knees, gasping. Wyatt reached her a second later, pulling her into his arms. In the water below, Thomas surfaced, sputtering. But Miller's men were already there, having anticipated his escape route. Boats surrounded him. There was nowhere left to run. They pulled Thomas Ashford from the bay in handcuffs. His expensive suit ruined, his carefully constructed new identity shattered. As they led him past Grace, he looked at her with pure hatred. "You couldn't just disappear," he hissed. "You had to ruin everything." Grace stood, Wyatt's arm around her shoulders, and looked Thomas in the eye. "No," she said quietly. "You ruined everything years ago. For me, for Maggie, for Rachel, for all the others. I'm just making sure you finally pay for it." Thomas was led away, still cursing, still blaming everyone but himself. Grace turned to Wyatt and let herself finally break down, sobbing against his chest while he held her tight. "It's over," he murmured. "It's finally over." The trial lasted 2 weeks. Grace and Maggie both testified. So did 12 other women who traveled to San Francisco to tell their stories. The evidence was overwhelming. Thomas Ashford was convicted of mail fraud, theft, conspiracy, and accessory to murder in Rachel Brennan's death. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison. Vernon Holloway, back in Montana, also faced trial for arson. He received 6 months reduced because of his age and his son Dale's testimony about his grief-driven state of mind. Sheriff Porter was removed from office, replaced by a deputy who actually enforced the law. And slowly, painfully, Copper Ridge began to heal. Grace and Wyatt returned to Montana in early spring. Emma ran to meet them, throwing herself into Grace's arms with such force they both nearly fell. "I missed you, Mama Grace. I missed you so much. I missed you too, sweetheart." Every single day. They stood in the meadow where Wyatt's cabin had once stood. The burned timbers had been cleared away, and in their place, the frame of a new building rose against the blue sky. The town helped, Mrs. Caldwell explained. Tom Fletcher organized work crews. Dr. Shaw donated supplies. Even Helen Whitaker contributed lumber. Grace looked at the structure taking shape. It was larger than the old cabin, room for a real family. Wyatt came to stand beside her. "What do you think?" "I think it's home," Grace said softly. "I think we're finally home." And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace believed it was true. The Montana sky had never looked so blue. Grace stood at the window of Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, watching the spring sunshine paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, not the fragile, temporary kind that could shatter with the next crisis, but something deeper. Something that felt like it might actually last. Behind her, Emma was chattering to Maggie about the foal that had been born at Tom Fletcher's stable, her voice bright with excitement. The bandage was long gone from her head, leaving only a small white scar above her eyebrow that Grace kissed every night before bed. A reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything and how far they'd come since. 3 months had passed since San Francisco. 3 months since Thomas Ashford had been sentenced to federal prison, his carefully constructed empire of lies dismantled piece by piece. 3 months since Grace had stood in that courtroom and watched justice finally be served. The letter had arrived that morning, forwarded from the San Francisco courthouse. Grace had read it twice already, but she pulled it from her pocket and read it again, still hardly believing the words. "Mrs. Winters, as part of the restitution ordered by the court, you are entitled to compensation from the liquidation of Thomas Ashford's assets. Your portion amounts to $473. Please contact the office below to arrange payment." $473. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough to buy materials for the new cabin. Enough to purchase horses for the stable she and Wyatt were planning. Enough to give Emma a real education, maybe even to send her to school in Helena someday. Grace folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into her pocket. Then she turned to Maggie, who was bouncing Emma on her knee, her own belly round and prominent now, at 7 months pregnant. "I'm going to see Wyatt," Grace said. "Will you watch Emma for a bit?" "Of course." Maggie smiled, that soft smile she'd been wearing more often lately. "Take your time. Dale's coming by later to help me with some errands." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Dale Holloway's been coming by quite a lot lately." Maggie blushed. "He's been kind, helpful, and he's trying to make amends for what his father did." "He's a good man," Grace agreed. Nothing like Vernon. No, nothing like Vernon. Grace kissed Emma's head, promised to be back before supper, and stepped out into the spring afternoon. The town looked different now. Or maybe she was the one who was different. Either way, when she walked down the main street of Copper Ridge, people nodded to her. Some even smiled. Helen Whitaker actually waved from the window of her mercantile. The ride out to Wyatt's land took 20 minutes on the mare Mrs. Caldwell had lent her. Grace had learned to ride properly over the winter, spending hours with Wyatt learning to handle a horse with confidence instead of fear. Now she sat easy in the saddle, her body moving with the mare's rhythm, enjoying the feel of sun on her face and wind in her hair. The new cabin was taking shape beautifully. The frame was complete, the roof half shingled. It was larger than the old one, with 2 bedrooms and a real kitchen and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Wyatt had drawn the plans himself, making adjustments based on Grace's suggestions until it felt like something they'd designed together. She found him on the roof, hammering shingles into place with steady practiced strokes. His shirt was off despite the cool air, his skin bronzed by the sun and gleaming with sweat. Grace watched him work for a moment, admiring the strength in his shoulders, the careful precision of his movements. "You're going to catch cold working like that," she called up. Wyatt looked down and grinned, an expression she was seeing more and more often these days. He climbed down the ladder with easy grace despite his limp. "Came to supervise?" he asked, reaching for his shirt. Grace pulled the letter from her pocket. "Came to tell you we can afford glass windows now. Real ones, not oiled paper." Wyatt read the letter, his expression shifting from surprise to satisfaction. "This is good news. It's better than good." Grace felt tears prick her eyes even though she was smiling. "It means Thomas finally paid for something. It means we're not starting with nothing." "We were never starting with nothing," Wyatt said quietly. "We had each other." He pulled her close, careful of his sweaty state, but she didn't care. She wrapped her arms around him and held on, breathing in the scent of sawdust and honest work. "I need to tell you something," Wyatt said into her hair. Grace pulled back to look at him. "What is it I've been thinking about the future? About what we're building here?" He gestured to the cabin, the land, the distant mountains. "This place, it's not just mine anymore. It hasn't been for a long time." "I know," Grace said. "The deed says 10 acres are mine. I'm not talking about the deed." Wyatt's hands framed her face, callous thumbs gentle on her cheeks. "I'm talking about this. Us. Emma. The life we're making." His voice dropped lower, uncertain in a way she rarely heard. "I loved Rachel. I'll always love her. But she's gone and you're here. And somewhere along the way, helping you became the thing that saved me too." Wyatt, Grace whispered, "Let me finish." He took a breath. "You came here broken, thinking you didn't deserve anything good. I was broken too, punishing myself for failing someone I loved. We were both so convinced we didn't deserve a second chance that we almost missed it. But we didn't miss it," Grace said. "No, we didn't. And I don't want to wait anymore. Don't want to pretend this is temporary or that we're just helping each other get by." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver ring. Simple, worn, beautiful. This was Rachel's engagement ring. "I've carried it for 5 years, couldn't bear to sell it or give it away. But I think she'd want you to have it. Not because you're replacing her, but because she'd want me to be happy. And you make me happy, Grace. You and Emma both." Grace's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely now. "Marry me." Wyatt's voice was rough with emotion. "Not because you need protection or because you owe me anything, but because we're good together. Because I love you. And I think maybe you love me too." "I do love you," Grace said through her tears. "I've been so scared to admit it, so scared to believe I deserve this. But yes, yes, I'll marry you." Wyatt slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the sunlight like a promise made solid. Then he kissed her, and it was nothing like the careful, restrained touches they'd shared before so. This was deep and certain and full of all the things they'd been too afraid to say. Grace kissed him back with everything she had, pouring months of longing and fear and hope into the touch of her lips on his. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers. When he asked. Soon, Grace said, "As soon as we can. I don't want to wait either." They set the date for September, giving them time to finish the cabin and for Maggie's baby to be born. The whole town seemed to embrace the wedding with an enthusiasm that surprised Grace. It was as if Copper Ridge wanted to prove to itself that it could be better, could celebrate instead of condemn. Mrs. Caldwell insisted on making the dress. Helen Whitaker donated fabric, beautiful cream-colored silk that must have cost more than Grace could afford. Dr. Shaw offered to give Grace away since she had no family of her own. And Maggie, who gave birth to a healthy baby boy in June and named him Samuel, insisted on making the wedding cake. Even Dale Holloway contributed, offering to build benches for the ceremony and help set up the meadow where they'd hold the celebration. The months between spring and fall passed in a blur of activity. Grace and Wyatt worked side by side on the cabin, finishing the roof, installing those glass windows, and building furniture for the rooms. Emma helped where she could, handing tools and fetching water and chattering constantly about how excited she was to have a real house. In July, Wyatt hired 2 men from town to help him build a stable on Grace's 10 acres. Not a barn for workhorses, but something finer. A place to board and train animals, to give riding lessons to children, to create something beautiful and useful. "What should we call it?" Wyatt asked one evening as they stood looking at the nearly completed structure. "Emma's Meadow," Grace said without hesitation. "After the bravest little girl I know." Emma, who'd been playing nearby, looked up with shining eyes. "Really? You'd name it after me?" "We already did, sweetheart." Wyatt lifted her onto his shoulders. "This is your meadow, your stable, your future." Emma threw her arms around his neck, and Grace had to turn away, overcome by the simple rightness of it. This man who'd lost so much had opened his heart to a child who wasn't his by blood, but was his in every way that mattered. Vernon Holloway was released from jail in August. Grace had dreaded his return, feared he'd try to stir up trouble again. But the man who came back to Copper Ridge was different from the one who'd left. Quieter, humbled. He'd lost weight in prison and gained something else. Perspective, maybe, or just exhaustion. He came to see Grace and Wyatt one afternoon, standing awkwardly at the edge of their property, like he wasn't sure he had the right to approach. Wyatt saw him first and immediately moved between Vernon and Grace, protective. "What do you want, Holloway?" Vernon removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "To apologize, if you'll hear it." Grace came to stand beside Wyatt, her hand finding his. "We'll hear it." Vernon's voice was rough when he spoke. "I let my grief over Thomas turn me into something I'm ashamed of. My boy, he wasn't always bad. Used to be a sweet kid and always trying to make me proud. But somewhere along the way he changed, got greedy, got mean. And instead of seeing it, instead of stopping him, I made excuses. Told myself he was just ambitious, just smart." He looked up, meeting their eyes directly. "When he died, or when I thought he died, I couldn't accept that he'd been rotten all the way through. So I blamed everyone else. Blamed his victims for tempting him. Blamed you, Mrs. Winters, for existing. Easier than admitting I'd failed as a father. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Don't deserve it. Just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For the fire, for the violence, for trying to drive you away. You didn't deserve any of it." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your son made his own choices, Mr. Holloway. You couldn't have stopped him even if you'd tried. Maybe not, but I could have tried harder." Vernon put his hat back on. "I'll be leaving Copper Ridge, moving to Oregon to live with my daughter. Can't stay here with all these memories. But before I go, I wanted you to know that what you're building here, this stable, this life, it's good. It's what this place needs." He nodded once and turned to leave. "Mr. Holloway," Grace called. He stopped. "Thank you for apologizing. It takes courage. Don't know about courage, but it's a start toward being able to look at myself in the mirror again." After Vernon left, Wyatt pulled Grace close. "You're a better person than I am. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to hit him too," Grace admitted. "But anger's exhausting, and I'm tired of being angry." She looked up at Wyatt. "I just want to be happy. With you, with Emma, with the life we're building." "Then that's what we'll be." September arrived in a blaze of golden light. The aspen trees turned yellow, painting the mountains in brilliant color. The air held that perfect crispness that promised autumn but hadn't yet delivered winter's bite. The day before the wedding, Grace stood in her new bedroom in the completed cabin, looking at the dress Mrs. Caldwell had made. It was simple but beautiful, the cream silk falling in soft folds, tiny pearl buttons running down the back. Maggie came in carrying baby Samuel, who at 3 months was already smiling and cooing at everyone he saw. "It's gorgeous," Maggie breathed. "You're going to look like a princess." "I'm going to look like a woman who finally stopped running." Grace said. Maggie set Samuel in his basket and came to stand beside Grace. You saved my life, you know. When I showed up here pregnant and penniless, and you took me in, made me feel like I wasn't alone. I'll never forget that. You would have done the same for me. Maybe. But you did it first. Maggie smiled. And now look at us, both of us getting our happy endings. Are you and Dale Grace started? Not yet, but maybe someday. Maggie's expression was soft. He's patient, kind, nothing like his father. And Samuel deserves a father who'll love him even though he's another man's child. Emma burst into the room, her own new dress swirling around her legs. Mama Grace, Mr. Wyatt says I get to throw flowers tomorrow. Real flowers. That's right, sweetheart. You're the flower girl. Emma spun in a circle, then stopped. Mama Grace, after tomorrow, will Mr. Wyatt be my Papa Grace? Knelt down to Emma's level. Would you like him to be? Emma nodded vigorously. I love him, and he loves us. That makes him family, right? That makes him family. Grace agreed, pulling Emma into a hug. Forever family. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect. Grace woke in Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house her last morning as an unmarried woman and felt no nerves at all. Only certainty, only joy. Mrs. Caldwell helped her dress, pinning her hair with wild flowers that Wyatt had picked himself. Emma wore a pink dress and carried a basket of petals. Maggie wore blue and held Samuel. Dr. Shaw arrived in a borrowed buggy to drive them to the meadow. The whole town had turned out. More than 150 people gathered in the golden afternoon light. Someone had built an arch decorated with more wildflowers and trailing vines. Benches lined the meadow in neat rows, and at the front, waiting beside the preacher, stood Wyatt. He wore a black suit that Grace had never seen before, his hair neatly combed, his face clean-shaven. But it was his expression that stopped her breath. The way he looked at her as she walked toward him on Dr. Shaw's arm, like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. Emma went first, scattering petals with serious concentration. Then Grace and Dr. Shaw walked slowly up the makeshift aisle. People smiled as she passed. Helen Whitaker dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Tom Fletcher gave her a thumbs up. Even Sheriff Porter's replacement tipped his hat. Dr. Shaw placed Grace's hand in Wyatt's and stepped back. The preacher began to speak, but Grace barely heard the words. She was too focused on Wyatt's face, on the way his thumb stroked the back of her hand, on the future she could see reflected in his eyes. Then it was time for vows. The preacher nodded to Wyatt. Wyatt took a breath and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Grace, I promise to choose you every day, to remind you of your worth when you forget, to stand beside you against whatever comes. You've taught me that healing isn't about forgetting the past, it's about building something new that honors it. I'll spend the rest of my life being the man you see when you look at me. Grace's turn. Her voice shook at first but grew stronger. Wyatt, I promise to trust your love, even when I'm scared, to build our future with my whole heart, to believe I deserve this, deserve the happiness we've found. You showed me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept that we're worthy of being chosen. I choose you right back, today and always. The preacher smiled. By the power vested in me by Montana Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Wyatt pulled Grace close and kissed her while the crowd erupted in cheers. Emma jumped up and down, clapping. Maggie wiped her eyes, and Grace felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Home. She was finally truly home. The reception lasted until dark, with music and dancing, and more food than anyone could eat. Mrs. Caldwell had organized the whole thing with military precision. There was roasted beef and potatoes, fresh bread and butter, 3 different kinds of bong, and Maggie's wedding cake that stood 3 layers tall and tasted like heaven. People took turns congratulating them. Tom Fletcher gave Wyatt a new set of horseshoes hand-forged in his shop. Helen Whitaker presented Grace with a bolt of wool fabric. Even the banker who'd lost money to Thomas Ashford shook Wyatt's hand and wished them well. As the sun set, someone brought out a guitar and people began to dance. Wyatt led Grace onto the makeshift dance floor, pulling her close as the music swelled. Happy, he murmured into her hair. So happy, I'm afraid I'll wake up and it'll all be a dream. Not a dream. This is real. We're real. They danced as the stars came out, as Emma fell asleep in Mrs. Caldwell's lap, as the celebration slowly wound down. When most of the guests had left, Wyatt and Grace walked hand in hand to their new cabin, their new life, their new beginning. Emma woke up just long enough to be carried inside and tucked into her new bed in her new room. Grace kissed her forehead and whispered, "Sweet dreams, my brave girl." Then she and Wyatt stood in the main room of their cabin, finally alone, finally married, finally free of all the ghosts that had haunted them. "No more running," Grace said. "No more hiding," Wyatt agreed. He pulled her close and kissed her, and Grace let herself fall into it completely. Let herself believe that this was allowed, that she could have this, that she deserved every moment of happiness that came her way. The months after the wedding settled into a rhythm that felt both new and timeless. Grace woke each morning in Wyatt's arms, made breakfast for her family, then spent the day working at Emma's meadow stables while Wyatt managed the ranch. The stable became more successful than either of them had dreamed. Word spread about the widow who could gentle the wildest horse, who taught children to ride with patience and care. People brought their animals from as far as Helena, paying for boarding and training. Emma proved to have her adopted mother's gift with horses. At 7 years old, she could calm a spooked mare with just her voice, could read an animal's mood from its stance and ear position. Grace watched her daughter blossom into confidence and felt her heart swell with pride. By December, Grace realized she was pregnant. She knew before the doctor confirmed it, knew from the way her body felt different, the morning sickness that sent her running outside before breakfast, the tenderness in her breasts. She waited until she was certain, until Dr. Shaw had examined her and confirmed what she already knew. Then one evening after Emma was asleep, she told Wyatt. They were sitting by the fire, Grace mending one of his shirts, while he carved a new toy horse for Emma. The domestic scene was so peaceful, so perfect, that Grace almost hated to disrupt it. "Wyatt," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." He looked up, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." The carving knife stilled in his hands. "You're sure Dr. Shaw confirmed it today?" "About 2 months along. The baby should come in July." Wyatt set down the knife and the half-finished horse very carefully. Then he crossed to Grace, pulled her to her feet, and wrapped his arms around her so tight she could barely breathe. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Grace asked, suddenly uncertain. "We never talked about this. I know Emma's not yours by blood, and now there'll be another child, and I didn't plan. I should have been more careful." Wyatt pulled back just far enough to look at her face. "Grace, I'm not just happy. He searched for words. "I'm overwhelmed. In the best way. You've given me everything. A home, a family, a reason to stop punishing myself. And now a child." He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "This is a gift. You're a gift. And I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for it." Grace started crying, hormones and relief and pure joy, it all tangled together. Wyatt held her while she wept, murmuring reassurances, stroking her hair. "Emma's going to be so excited," Grace said when she could speak again. "She's been asking when she'll get a brother or sister." "Then let's tell her tomorrow, as a family." They told Emma over breakfast the next morning. The child's eyes went wide, then she let out a squeal that probably woke everyone within a mile. "A baby, a real baby," Grace confirmed. "You're going to be a big sister." Emma launched herself at Grace, hugging her stomach gently. "Hi, baby, I'm Emma. I'm going to teach you about horses and reading and how to make Mr. Wyatt smile. He's your papa. He's my papa too now." Wyatt caught Grace's eye over Emma's head, his expression tender. "We're a family," he mouthed. "Yeah," Grace mouthed back. Finally. Winter passed into spring and Grace's belly grew round and prominent. She continued working at the stable as long as she could, teaching riding lessons and managing the business. Maggie helped when Grace needed to rest, baby Samuel growing chubby and cheerful under his mother's devoted care. Dale Holloway finally worked up the courage to propose to Maggie in April. She said yes, tears streaming down her face, and they planned a quiet wedding for June. "I'm so happy for you," Grace told Maggie, as they sat in the stable office watching Emma teach a nervous 8-year-old girl how to brush a horse. "I never thought I'd get this," Maggie said softly. "After Thomas, after everything, I thought I was ruined, used up, worthy of nothing but shame. But you weren't. No, neither of us were." Maggie placed her hand over Grace's. "We survived. We built something beautiful from the ashes. That's not weakness. That's strength." Grace squeezed her friend's hand. "You're going to be so happy with Dale. He's a good man. He is. Nothing like his father, nothing like Thomas. He sees Samuel as his son already, loves him like he's his own blood. That's what family is, Grace said. Not blood, choice. Wyatt chose Emma, Dale chose Samuel, and we chose to believe we deserve to be loved. In May, Grace received another letter from San Francisco. More women had come forward with testimony against Thomas Ashford. His sentence had been extended to 30 years. He would likely die in prison. Grace read the letter, felt a moment of grim satisfaction, then burned it in the fireplace. She didn't need to carry that hatred anymore. Thomas was gone from her life in every way that mattered. He'd taken enough from her. She wouldn't give him another moment of her time. The baby came on a sweltering July afternoon, 2 weeks early and in a hurry. Grace's water broke while she was hanging laundry, soaking her dress and sending Wyatt into a panic. "Get Dr. Shaw!" Grace gasped, clutching the clothesline. "Now!" Wyatt ran, leaving Emma with Maggie and riding into town faster than was probably safe. He returned with Dr. Shaw in record time, both of them breathless. The labor was quick, intense, nothing like the long, drawn-out agony some women described. Grace labored for 4 hours, Wyatt holding her hand and murmuring encouragement before the baby arrived in a rush of fluid and relief. "A girl," Dr. Shaw announced, holding up the squalling infant. "Healthy and strong." Grace reached for her daughter, this tiny, perfect creature with a shock of dark hair and furious blue eyes. The baby quieted the moment Grace held her, nuzzling instinctively toward her breast. "She's beautiful," Wyatt whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She looks like you. She has your stubbornness," Grace said through tears. "Listen to those lungs. What will you name her?" Grace had been thinking about this for months. There was only one name that felt right. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope. Hope Brennan." Wyatt tested it out, smiled. "Perfect." Emma was allowed in once Grace was cleaned up and resting. The 7-year-old approached the bed cautiously, eyes huge. "Can I hold her?" Grace showed Emma how to sit carefully, how to support the baby's head. Emma held her new sister with exaggerated care, her face a study in wonder. "Hi, Hope. I'm your big sister, Emma. I'm going to protect you and teach you everything and love you forever." Grace met Wyatt's eyes over the children's heads. This moment, this was everything she'd thought she'd lost when John Winters died and the police came knocking. This was everything she'd hoped for when she answered Thomas Ashford's advertisement. This was everything she deserved. The first year of Hope's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and infinite small joys. The baby was healthy, happy, and absolutely adored by her entire family. Emma took her role as big sister with utmost seriousness, always making sure Hope had her favorite blanket, always singing to her when she fussed. Wyatt was a revelation as a father. Grace had known he'd be good with children, had seen it with Emma. But watching him with Hope was something else entirely. He would walk the floor with her for hours when she was colicky, singing old trail songs in his rough voice. He built her a cradle from cherry wood carved with intricate patterns of horses and flowers. Emma's meadow stables continued to thrive. Grace hired 2 local men to help with the daily work so she could focus on teaching and training. By Hope's first birthday, they had 15 horses in regular training and a waiting list for riding lessons. Maggie and Dale's marriage was happy, their combined family a testament to love's ability to heal. Samuel called Dale Papa and didn't remember Thomas Ashford at all. Dale proved to be a devoted husband and father, working hard to make up for the sins of his own father. Copper Ridge itself had changed. The town that had once been so quick to judge, so ready to condemn, had learned something from Grace's story. When other newcomers arrived fleeing difficult pasts or seeking fresh starts, the town welcomed them instead of turning them away. Helen Whitaker even started a charitable fund to help widows and single mothers inspired by Grace's struggles. Mrs. Caldwell expanded her boarding house specifically to offer reduced rates to women in difficult circumstances. It wasn't perfect. There were still people who remembered Grace as Thomas Ashford's mail-order bride, who whispered about her past. But they were in the minority now, and Grace had learned not to care what people thought. She knew her own worth. Wyatt reminded her daily. Emma and Hope showed her every moment. On Hope's first birthday, they held a party in the meadow. The whole town came bringing gifts and food and good wishes. Emma helped Hope smash her first cake, both girls ending up covered in frosting. Wyatt took photographs with the new camera he'd bought, wanting to preserve every moment. As the party wound down and the sun began to set, Grace found herself standing at the edge of the meadow, watching her family. Wyatt was tossing Hope in the air, making her shriek with laughter. Emma was dancing with Maggie's son Samuel, both children giggling. Maggie and Dale stood together, his arm around her waist, watching their combined family with contentment. Dr. Shaw came to stand beside Grace. Quite a change from 2 years ago, isn't it? Grace smiled. I barely recognized myself. That woman who stepped off the stagecoach, so scared and desperate. She feels like a stranger now. She wasn't a stranger. She was you. Just a you who didn't know yet that she deserved all this. Do you really think people get what they deserve? Grace asked. Or do we just get what we get and we make the best of it? Dr. Shaw considered. I think we get what we're willing to fight for. You fought for this, for Emma, for a future, for the right to be happy. And you won. We won, Grace corrected. Wyatt and I together, yes. Dr. Shaw smiled. Love's a powerful thing when two people decide they're worth saving. Wyatt called to Grace, gesturing her over. She excused herself and walked to him, this man who'd given her everything, who'd shown her that she was worthy of being chosen. He handed hope to Emma and pulled Grace into his arms. Happy? He asked the same question he'd asked on their wedding day. So happy, I still can't quite believe it's real. Believe it. He kissed her forehead. This is our life. We built it together. Grace leaned into him, watching their daughters play, watching the sun paint the mountains gold, watching the future unfold in front of them like a promise. She thought about Thomas Ashford rotting in a federal prison and felt nothing, no anger, no hatred, not even satisfaction, just indifference. He was irrelevant to her life now. She thought about Rachel Brennan, whose death had set all of this in motion, and hoped the woman had found peace. Rachel's ring still sat on Grace's finger, worn now, but precious. A symbol of love that transcended death, that made room for new love without erasing what came before. She thought about the woman she'd been in New York, accused of murder, stripped of everything, drowning in shame. That Grace would never have believed this future was possible. But this Grace, the one who'd survived fraud and hatred and violence, who'd fought for her daughter and herself, who'd learned to accept love without feeling like she had to earn it, this Grace knew better. You deserve me. That's what Wyatt had said to her that first night in Copper Ridge. You deserve me. She hadn't believed him then, thought it was pity or guilt or some misguided sense of obligation. But she believed him now, believed it with every fiber of her being. She deserved him. She deserved Emma. She deserved hope. She deserved this meadow and this stable and this life they'd built from absolutely nothing. And more importantly, she knew that Wyatt deserved her too. Deserved her strength and her fierce love and her refusal to give up. They'd saved each other in the end, two broken people who'd found their way to wholeness together. Emma ran over Hope, toddling after her on unsteady legs. Mama Grace, can we have another party tomorrow? Grace laughed. I think one party is enough for now, sweetheart. But it was so fun, and everyone was happy. Then we'll have another party soon, Wyatt promised. We have a lot to celebrate. He was right. They did have a lot to celebrate. Every day was worth celebrating when you'd fought this hard to earn it. The sun finished setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Stars began to appear bright and constant in the darkening sky. Someone lit lanterns around the meadow, casting warm circles of light. Grace pulled both her daughters close, one arm around Emma, the other holding Hope. Wyatt wrapped his arms around all three of them, and they stood there as a family watching the night deepen. This is everything, Grace thought. This moment, this family, this hard-won peace. This is everything I thought I'd lost. Everything I didn't think I deserved. Everything I needed. Mama Grace, Emma said quietly. Are you crying? Happy tears, sweetheart. The best kind. The meadow was still now, the party over, the guests departed. Just the four of them standing together in the gathering darkness. Grace looked at the stable. They'd built the cabin that was their home, the land that was theirs. Emma's meadow, a place for broken spirits to learn to trust again. A place where wounded creatures, both human and horse, could find healing. A place where a desperate widow with a borrowed daughter had found not just shelter, but a future. Thank you, Grace whispered to Wyatt, for everything, for seeing me when I was invisible, for choosing me when I thought I was worthless, for teaching me that love isn't about deserving. Same to you, Wyatt said, his voice rough with emotion. You saved me just as much as I saved you. Maybe more. We saved each other. Yes, we did. Hope started to fuss, tired and overstimulated. Grace kissed her dark hair and began walking toward the house, her family following. Emma chattered about the party, about the cake, about how grown up she felt at 7 years old. Wyatt carried the lantern lighting their way home. Inside the cabin, Grace nursed Hope while Wyatt got Emma ready for bed. She could hear him reading to Emma, his voice gentle, as he brought the story to life. This was their routine, now worn smooth by repetition, comfortable as old boots. After Hope fell asleep and Emma was tucked in, Grace and Wyatt sat together on the porch watching the stars wheel overhead. The night was cool but not cold, the air scented with sage and wildflowers. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Grace asked. "If Thomas hadn't died? If you hadn't helped me that first night? If any of it had gone differently?" "Every day," Wyatt admitted. "If Thomas hadn't lied, you never would have come here, and I never would have met you." Wyatt pulled her close. "So maybe some lies lead to truth after all. Maybe the worst things that happen to us sometimes lead to the best things. Not because the bad stuff was good, but because we're strong enough to build something beautiful from the wreckage." Grace thought about that, about all the wreckage she'd survived. John Winter's death and the suspicion that followed. Sarah's death and the promise Grace had made. Thomas Ashford's lies and the debt she'd inherited. The hostility of Copper Ridge. The rock that struck Emma. The fire that destroyed Wyatt's home. So much wreckage. So many reasons to give up, to believe she was cursed, to accept that she deserved nothing good. But she hadn't given up. And here she was on the other side of it all, with everything that mattered. "I used to think I didn't deserve love," Grace said quietly. "That I was broken, worthless, tainted by everything that had happened to me. And now I know I deserved you all along." She turned to face him. "I just needed someone brave enough to prove it. Someone who saw past the lies people told about me and saw the truth underneath." Wyatt cupped her face in his hands. "The truth is, you're the strongest person I've ever met. You've survived things that would have broken most people. You've built a life and a family from nothing. You've forgiven people who didn't deserve forgiveness and loved people who desperately needed it." He kissed her softly. "I'm the one who doesn't deserve you, but I'm selfish enough to keep you anyway." Grace laughed through fresh tears. "We're both selfish then, because I'm never letting you go." "Good. Don't." They sat together in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the prairie stretch out before them in silver moonlight. In the distance, horses moved quietly in the stable. Closer in the cabin behind them, their daughters slept peacefully. This was home. Not the building, though Grace loved every beam and board of it. Not the land, though she'd fought for every acre. Home was this. The people she loved, the family she'd chosen and been chosen by the life they'd built together. Grace Ann Brennan, formerly Winters, formerly whoever she'd been before all of this. She'd had so many names, so many identities. Widow, suspect, mail-order bride, victim, survivor. But the only name that mattered now was the simplest one. Wife, mother, woman who'd learned she was worthy of love. The stars turned overhead, ancient and indifferent. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of coming autumn. And on the porch of a cabin in Montana Territory, two people who'd lost everything held on to each other and the future they'd fought for. Tomorrow, Grace would wake early and make breakfast. She'd feed the horses and teach riding lessons. She'd nurse Hope and help Emma with her studies. She'd work beside Wyatt to build their business, their family, their life. Tomorrow and the day after that, and the day after that, for all the years to come. Because she'd finally learned the truth that had eluded her for so long. The truth Wyatt had tried to tell her from the very beginning. She deserved this, all of it. The love and the peace and the simple daily joy of watching her children grow. She deserved it, not because she'd earned it through suffering, but because every human being deserved to be seen and valued and chosen. And she'd been chosen. By Wyatt, by Emma, by this community that had learned to be better, by life itself offering her one more chance to be happy. She'd taken that chance, grabbed it with both hands and held on tight through every storm that tried to tear it away. And now, finally, she could rest, could breathe, could simply be happy without waiting for disaster to strike. The night deepened. The stars brightened, and Grace Brennan sat on her porch with her husband's arm around her shoulders, feeling the weight of her hard-won peace settle over her like a blessing. She'd come to Copper Ridge as a desperate woman with nothing left to lose. She'd stayed and fought and built and loved. And in doing so, she'd found everything she'd thought was gone forever. Home, family, purpose, hope, hope. Grace smiled, thinking of her youngest daughter sleeping peacefully inside. The name had been perfect, because hope was what had saved her in the end. Hope that things could get better. Hope that she deserved more than she'd been given. Hope that love was possible, even after everything that had tried to destroy it. And Hope had been right. Inside the cabin, Hope Brennan dreamed baby dreams, safe in her cradle, loved beyond measure. Emma slept with her wooden horse clutched tight, secure in the knowledge that she was wanted and cherished. And outside on the porch, Grace and Wyatt held each other and watched their future unfold beneath the Montana stars. Everything she'd survived, everything she'd lost, everything she'd fought for, it had all led here, to this moment, to this family, to this life. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.